Throughout modern investigative history, authorities have documented cases in which individuals vanished without leaving physical evidence, confirmed sightings, or reliable traces, forcing investigators to confront situations where disappearance occurs. Despite established surveillance systems and standardized investigative procedures designed to prevent such outcomes, these disappearances are categorized separately from typical missing person cases because they lack indicators of violence, preparation, or intent, removing the foundational clues normally used to determine whether a disappearance was voluntary, accidental, or criminal in nature. In many verified cases, the individuals were last observed performing routine activities such as commuting, shopping, or attending appointments, behavior that suggests continuity rather than disruption, making the sudden absence particularly difficult to contextualize. Investigators rely heavily on behavioral analysis during early stages. Yet in these cases, background checks, interviews, and personal histories often reveal no psychological distress, conflict, or instability that might explain an intentional disappearance. Surveillance technology is assumed to provide coverage in public and semi-public environments, but numerous disappearances occur in areas monitored by cameras, access controls, and digital tracking systems that nevertheless fail to produce a complete visual or chronological record. Reviews of surveillance footage frequently reveal partial documentation, showing individuals entering locations without corresponding exit footage, highlighting blind spots, system limitations, or human oversight within monitoring infrastructure. These gaps complicate reconstruction efforts, as investigators must infer movement rather than confirm it, increasing reliance on probability instead of verifiable sequence. Digital evidence has become central to modern investigations, yet some disappearance cases involve abrupt termination of phone signals, location data, and financial activity without technical explanation or subsequent reactivation. Analysts must then determine whether such digital silence results from deliberate actions, technical failure, environmental interference, or unknown external events, each possibility carrying different investigative implications. The absence of digital interaction after disappearance eliminates common investigative anchors, such as transaction trails or communication records, significantly reducing the ability to establish post-disappearance movement. Vehicles linked to missing individuals are sometimes later discovered intact and undamaged, containing personal belongings that contradict theories of voluntary departure or planned disappearance. The presence of essential items within abandoned vehicles introduces contradictions that investigators must reconcile, as intentional disappearance typically involves removal of identifying materials and resources. Family accounts often emphasize the individual's future plans, responsibilities, and stability, contributing context that challenges assumptions of self-initiated absence. While investigators remain cautious about relying solely on retrospective testimony, consistent patterns across unrelated cases reinforce the difficulty of explaining these disappearances through conventional psychological models. Collectively, these cases establish a phenomenon defined not by dramatic events, but by absence of evidence, placing investigators in a position where lack of information becomes the central obstacle rather than a starting point. As investigations progress, authorities begin comparing these disappearances across jurisdictions, identifying recurring structural similarities such as sudden loss of contact, absence of physical struggle, and incomplete surveillance coverage, which suggests systemic limitations rather than isolated investigative failure. One recurring challenge involves the assumption that populated environments naturally produce witnesses. Yet many disappearances occur in locations where bystanders later report seeing nothing unusual or fail to recall specific details. Human perception and memory limitations complicate these cases, as routine environments rarely prompt heightened attention, allowing critical moments to pass unnoticed and undocumented. Investigators must therefore evaluate not only what witnesses report, but also what they may have failed to perceive, introducing uncertainty into timeline reconstruction. In several documented cases, Access-controlled spaces, such as office buildings, parking structures, or transit hubs, become focal points due to incomplete or malfunctioning entry and exit records. Audits of these systems often reveal maintenance gaps, synchronization errors, or data retention limitations that undermine assumptions of comprehensive monitoring. These technical shortcomings demonstrate how reliance on automated systems can create false confidence in coverage and traceability. Search operations typically commence quickly, yet early delays or misinterpretation of last known locations can significantly reduce the likelihood of recovering meaningful evidence. Environmental variables such as weather, terrain, and urban infrastructure can further degrade evidence within short time frames, narrowing investigative windows. As time passes, cases shift from active search to analytical review, where investigators reassess initial assumptions and identify potential oversights. However, absence of new information limits the effectiveness of retrospective analysis, often resulting in circular reasoning rather than resolution. Interagency coordination introduces additional complexity, as jurisdictional boundaries and differing protocols can fragment investigative responsibility. Communication gaps between agencies may delay data sharing, hindering comprehensive analysis during critical early stages. These structural challenges contribute to cases remaining unresolved, not due to lack of effort, but due to compounded systemic constraints. By this stage, investigators often recognize that conventional investigative models may be insufficient to explain disappearances characterized primarily by absence rather than evidence. As cases remain unresolved, investigators increasingly rely on pattern analysis, comparing timelines, behaviors, and environmental contexts across multiple disappearances to identify structural similarities that might suggest overlooked mechanisms rather than isolated anomalies. This comparative approach often reveals that many individuals vanished within narrow time windows, sometimes minutes apart from last confirmed contact, emphasizing how quickly disappearance can occur without generating observable disturbance. The brevity of these windows limits investigative intervention, as authorities are often notified only after significant time has passed, reducing opportunities for immediate containment or observation. Technological assumptions play a critical role, as investigators expect mobile devices, cameras, and transaction systems to generate traceable data. Yet real cases demonstrate how these systems can fail simultaneously or independently. Failures may result from environmental interference, infrastructure limitations, or human behavior, none of which necessarily leave clear indicators within available records. The absence of corroborating data forces investigators to consider multiple competing explanations without sufficient evidence to prioritize one conclusively. Over time, cases accumulate unresolved elements, transforming them into cold cases defined more by unanswered questions than by actionable leads. Periodic review of these cases is conducted as new technologies emerge, including advances in data analytics, facial recognition, and forensic reconstruction. While such advances have resolved some historical cases, many disappearances remain resistant, suggesting that missing data cannot always be recovered retroactively. Families often continue to provide information long after official investigations slow, contributing personal records, memories, and hypotheses in hope of renewed attention. The prolonged uncertainty places emotional strain on relatives, who must navigate legal, psychological, and social consequences without closure. Investigators acknowledge that absence of evidence does not equate to absence of event. Yet without confirmation, definitive conclusions remain unattainable. These cases challenge the assumption that modern society can always account for individual movement and presence. They expose the limitations of surveillance, investigation, and documentation when critical moments go unobserved. At this point in the investigation, the phenomenon of people vanishing without a trace stands not as an anomaly, but as a documented reality that continues to resist explanation. As investigations move beyond initial search phases, authorities often revisit early assumptions, recognizing that first interpretations of timelines and locations may have unintentionally narrowed the scope of inquiry and excluded alternative movement paths. Reanalysis frequently reveals that last confirmed sightings were treated as fixed endpoints rather than probabilistic markers, limiting exploration of unverified routes or short deviations that could fundamentally alter understanding of the disappearance. This reliance on last known positions highlights a structural limitation, as investigative models depend heavily on confirmation rather than uncertainty, which may obscure critical transitional moments. In some cases, later discoveries show that key information was overlooked not due to negligence, but because it appeared insignificant when viewed without contextual hindsight. Witness statements revisited years later often gain relevance when compared against broader patterns identified in unrelated cases, demonstrating how isolated details may only gain meaning through comparison. Despite this, memory degradation and inconsistent recall introduce reliability issues, making retrospective witness analysis inherently limited. Investigators also confront institutional constraints, including case prioritization, funding limitations, and staffing changes that disrupt continuity over long periods. These disruptions can lead to fragmented knowledge, where no single investigator retains comprehensive understanding of the case history. Technological evolution introduces both opportunity and challenge, as older data formats, storage limitations, and privacy regulations may restrict access to historical records. Even when data exists, legal and technical barriers can prevent effective re-examination using modern tools. Some disappearances involve cross-jurisdictional complexity, where movement across municipal or national boundaries introduces additional layers of procedural delay. Coordination across jurisdictions depends on timely information sharing, which may not occur uniformly in the early stages of investigation. This fragmentation can prevent formation of a coherent narrative, leaving investigators with disconnected fragments rather than a continuous sequence. Over time, unresolved disappearances accumulate administrative classifications that shift focus from active search to archival status. Once categorized as cold cases, investigative momentum often diminishes despite ongoing interest from families and advocacy groups. Families frequently assume the role of independent investigators, gathering records, organizing information, and maintaining public awareness. While these efforts can generate renewed attention, they may also reflect the gap between institutional capacity and unresolved demand for answers. Psychological analysis of disappearance cases reveals that prolonged uncertainty produces distinct forms of grief, often described as ambiguous loss. This condition complicates emotional resolution, as absence prevents confirmation of death, while hope prevents closure. From an investigative perspective, ambiguous loss also complicates decision-making, as neither survival nor death can be conclusively established. Some cases experience renewed interest following unrelated discoveries, technological breakthroughs, or changes in investigative standards. Yet even with renewed scrutiny, missing foundational evidence limits the effectiveness of re-examination. These limitations underscore the importance of early-stage data preservation and comprehensive documentation. Despite lessons learned, new disappearance cases continue to emerge with similar structural characteristics. This repetition suggests that systemic vulnerabilities remain unresolved within investigative and monitoring frameworks. The phenomenon challenges confidence in assumptions about traceability, accountability, and oversight in modern environments. It reveals how routine settings can still allow disappearance without detection. Investigators acknowledge that not all unknowns can be resolved through technology alone. Human behavior, environmental complexity, and system limitations interact in ways that resist linear explanation. These cases persist because they lack definitive endpoints rather than because they lack investigative effort. Over time, unresolved disappearances transition from individual cases to collective patterns. These patterns raise broader questions about how disappearance is defined, detected, and interpret it. They also challenge legal, social, and institutional frameworks designed to provide resolution. The absence of answers becomes an enduring feature rather than a temporary phase. For investigators, the challenge lies not only in finding evidence, but in acknowledging when evidence may never surface. For families, uncertainty becomes a permanent condition rather than a stage to overcome. Society often moves on, but unresolved cases remain embedded in records and memory. Each disappearance adds to a growing archive of unanswered questions. These archives reflect the limits of certainty in complex systems. The phenomenon endures because it cannot be conclusively disproven or resolved. It remains a documented reality rather than a theoretical possibility. People continue to vanish without explanation. Investigations continue without closure. The question remains open, suspended between evidence and absence. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you. The story of Atlantis originates from two dialogues written by the Greek philosopher Plato around 360 BCE, known as Timaeus and Critias. In these texts, Atlantis is described as a powerful maritime civilization that existed beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The implication is historical memory, but the limitation is that Plato is the sole primary source. Plato presents Atlantis not as a mythological tale, but as a historical account allegedly passed down through Egyptian priests to the Athenian lawmaker, Solon. This transmission suggests a chain of preservation. However, no independent Egyptian records confirming Atlantis have been identified, creating a critical evidentiary gap for investigators. According to Plato, Atlantis existed approximately 9,000 years before Solon's time, placing it around 9600 BCE. This date predates most known complex civilizations. The implication challenges established timelines of human development, while the limitation lies in the absence of archaeological evidence supporting advanced societies from that period. Atlantis is described as a technologically advanced society with monumental architecture, complex canals, and a powerful navy. These features imply a high level of organization and engineering. However, no physical remains matching this description have been conclusively found, limiting the claim to literary description rather than material proof. In Plato's account, Atlantis ultimately fell out of favor with the gods and was destroyed by earthquakes and floods in a single day and night. This suggests a sudden natural catastrophe. The limitation is that no geological event of such scale has been definitively linked to a lost civilization matching Atlantis. Scholars debate whether Plato intended Atlantis as a literal historical account or as an allegory to illustrate moral and political ideas. This raises an investigative implication about authorial intent. The limitation is that Plato never explicitly clarifies whether Atlantis should be read as factual history or philosophical narrative. The location of Atlantis is described as beyond the Pillars of Hercules, commonly associated with the Strait of Gibraltar. This geographic reference implies a real place in the Atlantic Ocean. However, ancient geographic terminology was imprecise, limiting certainty about the exact area Plato intended to describe. Plato contrasts Atlantis with ancient Athens, portraying Athens as virtuous and Atlantis as morally corrupt despite its power. This narrative structure suggests symbolic storytelling. The limitation for historians is distinguishing between moral contrast and historical reporting within a philosophical text. No Greek historian contemporary to Plato, including Herodotus or Thucydides, mentions Atlantis. This absence raises questions about its historicity. The implication is selective sourcing, while the limitation is that silence in other records does not definitively disprove existence. Ancient Egyptian civilization kept extensive records, yet none explicitly reference a civilization matching Atlantis. This absence challenges Plato's claim of Egyptian origin. The limitation is that many Egyptian records have been lost, leaving open the possibility of missing documentation. Archaeological methodology relies on material remains such as tools, structures, and settlements. Atlantis, as described, would likely leave significant traces. The lack of such evidence implies non-existence or misidentification, but the limitation is that submerged or destroyed sites can be difficult to detect. Some researchers argue Atlantis could represent a memory of real natural disasters, such as large-scale floods. This suggests cultural transmission of catastrophe. The limitation is that correlating mythic narratives with specific geological events remains speculative without direct evidence. Plato's Critias dialogue ends abruptly, leaving the Atlantis narrative incomplete. This creates uncertainty about the intended conclusion. The implication is that crucial contextual information may be missing, while the limitation is that no continuation text has ever been recovered. The precision of Atlantis description, including measurements and urban layout, has been cited as evidence of realism. However, ancient authors often use detailed descriptions in fictional works. The limitation is that descriptive detail alone cannot establish historical authenticity. The story of Atlantis has survived for over 2 millennia through repeated copying of Plato's texts. This continuity implies lasting significance. At the same time, textual transmission introduces risks of alteration, limiting confidence that the surviving version reflects the original account exactly. During antiquity, some philosophers accepted Atlantis as historical, while others rejected it as fiction. This early division indicates ambiguity from the start. The limitation is that ancient scholarly opinion varied widely and was often influenced by philosophical alignment rather than evidence. Roman-era writers rarely expanded on Atlantis, suggesting limited acceptance. This silence implies skepticism or lack of interest. However, the limitation is that many Roman texts have not survived, reducing the completeness of the historical record. Medieval scholars largely ignored Atlantis, focusing instead on theological narratives. This gap implies loss of continuity in investigation. The limitation is that absence of discussion may reflect cultural priorities rather than conclusions about Atlantis' validity. Interest in Atlantis resurged during the Renaissance, when classical texts were re-examined. This renewed attention implies unresolved questions. The limitation is that interpretations during this period often blended emerging science with speculation. Early modern scholars attempted to reconcile Atlantis with biblical chronologies. This suggests efforts to integrate Plato's account into known history. The limitation is that such attempts were constrained by theological frameworks rather than empirical investigation. By the 19th century, Atlantis became associated with emerging ideas about lost civilizations. This reflects broader curiosity about human prehistory. The limitation is that archaeology was still developing, and many conclusions from this era lacked methodological rigor. Advances in geology introduced the concept of deep time, challenging Plato's proposed timeline. This created tension between textual tradition and scientific dating. The limitation is that geological evidence does not directly address specific cultural narratives like Atlantis. Oceanographic exploration in the modern era mapped much of the Atlantic seabed. This reduced the likelihood of large unknown landmasses. The implication is constraint on possible locations, while the limitation is that smaller or eroded sites could remain undetected. Despite extensive exploration, no submerged continent matching Atlantis has been found. This absence narrows interpretations. The limitation is that Plato may not have meant a continent in the modern geological sense. Linguistic analysis of Plato's Greek suggests deliberate rhetorical construction. This implies philosophical intent. The limitation is that rhetorical style does not exclude the possibility of historical reference. Some scholars propose Atlantis was inspired by earlier Greek myths of lost lands. This indicates cultural synthesis. The limitation is that mythological influence does not automatically negate historical foundations. The consistency of Atlantis' destruction narrative resembles known flood myths. This suggests a shared human response to catastrophe. The limitation is distinguishing symbolic storytelling from recorded history. No definitive artifacts, inscriptions, or settlements have been linked to Atlantis. This remains the central investigative barrier. The limitation is that absence of evidence cannot conclusively resolve the question. As a result, Atlantis occupies a space between philosophy, history, and legend. This ambiguity sustains ongoing investigation. The limitation is that interdisciplinary approaches still rely on the same limited primary source. At the end of this contextual phase, Atlantis remains defined by a single ancient account, extensive debate, and persistent gaps. The implication is unresolved historical uncertainty, while the limitation is clear. Without new evidence, Atlantis cannot be confirmed nor entirely dismissed. Modern archaeological investigation approaches Atlantis through comparative analysis, searching for real sites that might align with Plato's description. This implies Atlantis could be a distorted memory of an actual place. The limitation is that no candidate site matches all geographic, chronological, and cultural details simultaneously. One frequently examined hypothesis links Atlantis to the Minoan civilization on Crete and the island of Thera, modern Santorini. The implication is that Plato's story reflects a real Bronze Age society affected by catastrophe. The limitation is that the Minoans existed thousands of years later than Plato's proposed date. The volcanic eruption of Thera around 1600 BCE caused widespread destruction in the Aegean. This provides a documented natural disaster. However, the limitation is that the eruption did not sink a continent nor erase an entire civilization in a single day, as described by Plato. Archaeological evidence shows the Minoans were seafarers with advanced architecture and trade networks. This parallels some aspects of Atlantis. The limitation is that Minoan cities do not match Plato's concentric city layout or Atlantic location. Other researchers have proposed Atlantis was located near Spain, particularly around the region of ancient Tartessos. This suggests a Western Mediterranean origin. The limitation is that Tartessos declined gradually and lacks evidence of sudden destruction by flood. Geological surveys of southern Spain reveal ancient floodplains and tsunamis. This supports the idea of catastrophic events. However, the limitation is that such events do not confirm the existence of a highly advanced lost civilization. Some hypotheses place Atlantis in the Atlantic near the Azores. This relies on submerged plateaus and islands. The limitation is that geological data shows these formations are volcanic and never formed a large inhabited landmass. Plate tectonics demonstrate that continents do not sink rapidly. This scientific framework constrains literal interpretations of Plato's account. The limitation is that Plato may have used non-literal language, complicating geological evaluation. Underwater archaeology has expanded significantly with sonar and remote vehicles. This improves detection capabilities. However, the limitation is that extensive surveys have not revealed urban remains consistent with Atlantis. Investigations of ancient coastlines show sea levels were lower during the last ice age. This implies now submerged coastal settlements may exist. The limitation is that such sites would be small, not a vast empire as described. Some scholars argue Atlantis represents a composite of multiple societies remembered collectively. This implies cultural memory rather than a single location. The limitation is that composite models are difficult to verify archaeologically. Ancient oral traditions often compress time and exaggerate scale. This could explain discrepancies in dates and size. The limitation is that Plato provides specific figures, suggesting intentional structure rather than oral distortion. The lack of inscriptions referencing Atlantis is a major obstacle. Literate civilizations typically leave written records. The limitation is that destruction does not always erase all textual traces, raising doubts about total loss. Comparative mythology shows parallels between Atlantis and Near Eastern flood narratives. This suggests thematic borrowing. The limitation is that shared motifs do not equate to shared historical events. Scientific skepticism toward Atlantis increased with the professionalization of archaeology in the 20th century. This reflects stricter evidentiary standards. The limitation is that absence of acceptance does not equal definitive disproof. Some geological formations, once cited as ruins, were later identified as natural structures. This demonstrates the risk of misinterpretation. The limitation is that early claims damaged the credibility of Atlantis research. Satellite imagery has been used to identify potential ancient sites. This expands investigative tools. However, the limitation is that anomalies require excavation to confirm cultural origin. Funding and institutional support for Atlantis research is limited. This constrains systematic exploration. The limitation is that lack of resources reduces opportunities to test unconventional hypotheses. Mainstream archaeology prioritizes sites with corroborating evidence. Atlantis lacks this support. The implication is methodological exclusion, while the limitation is that unconventional discoveries can initially appear unsupported. Attempts to date Atlantis using ice core and sediment data face interpretive challenges. These records show climate events, but not cultural details. The limitation is connecting environmental data to specific societies. Plato's philosophical goals complicate historical analysis. He used narratives to illustrate political ideals. The limitation is separating illustrative fiction from potential historical reference. Some researchers argue Plato intentionally exaggerated scale to emphasize moral decline. This implies narrative construction. The limitation is that exaggeration cannot be quantitatively measured. The absence of contemporaneous corroboration remains critical. No external records align with Plato's timeline. The limitation is reliance on a single source. Archaeology depends on falsifiable claims. Atlantis, as defined, resists testing. This limits scientific engagement. The implication is methodological stagnation. Despite skepticism, periodic claims of discovery continue. This reflects enduring interest. The limitation is that none have withstood peer review. Media representations often conflate speculation with evidence. This obscures serious investigation. The limitation is public misunderstanding of scholarly consensus. Academic discourse increasingly frames Atlantis as a case study in myth and memory. This shifts focus from location to meaning. The limitation is that historical questions remain unresolved. Interdisciplinary studies attempt to integrate geology, history, and literature. This broadens analysis. The limitation is conflicting methodologies and conclusions. No single hypothesis currently satisfies textual, geological, and archaeological criteria. This highlights investigative limits. The limitation is that criteria themselves are debated. At this stage of investigation, Atlantis remains unsupported by material evidence yet persistently examined. The implication is ongoing uncertainty, while the limitation is unchanged. Without new data, conclusions cannot advance. The enduring presence of Atlantis in modern culture influences how historical mysteries are perceived. This impact shapes expectations of discovery and loss. The implication is that public imagination can pressure research directions, while the limitation is that cultural fascination does not substitute for empirical validation. Comparisons between Atlantis and other lost cities, such as Troy, are often made to suggest eventual discovery. Troy was once doubted, but later excavated. The limitation is that Troy had multiple independent references, while Atlantis relies on a single literary source. The case of Troy demonstrates how myth and history can intersect. This implies Atlantis could follow a similar trajectory. However, Troy's location and timeframe were broadly consistent across sources, a condition absent in the Atlantis narrative. Human fascination with vanished civilizations reflects concerns about fragility and collapse. Atlantis symbolizes sudden loss. The limitation is that symbolic relevance does not increase historical probability. Atlantis is often cited in discussions of climate change and sea level rise. This creates modern relevance. The limitation is that projecting contemporary concerns onto ancient texts risks misinterpretation. The narrative of sudden destruction resonates with known prehistoric flooding events. This suggests collective memory. The limitation is that memory alone cannot reconstruct specific civilizations. Academic caution persists because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Atlantis meets the first criterion, but not the second. The limitation is that evidentiary standards prevent speculative conclusions. The absence of physical remains limits not only confirmation, but also falsification. This keeps Atlantis in a suspended state. The limitation is methodological paralysis. Atlantis research illustrates how history depends on surviving evidence. What is lost cannot be tested. The implication is epistemological uncertainty, while the limitation is irreversible absence. Some scholars argue Atlantis should be studied as literature rather than archaeology. This reframes the question. The limitation is that it avoids addressing historical possibility directly. The persistence of debate reflects unresolved tension between text and material record. This tension defines the case. The limitation is that neither side can conclusively prevail. Advances in underwater exploration may change future assessments. Technology evolves. The limitation is that technological capability does not guarantee relevant discoveries. Even if a submerged site were found, proving it is Atlantis would remain difficult. Identification requires textual alignment. The limitation is interpretive ambiguity. Atlantis challenges assumptions about historical certainty. It exposes how much depends on documentation. The limitation is that unknowns cannot be quantified. The narrative continues to inspire investigation despite repeated negative findings. This persistence implies unresolved questions. The limitation is diminishing returns without new evidence. Atlantis functions as a boundary case for historical inquiry. It marks where evidence ends and interpretation begins. The limitation is recognizing that boundary without crossing into speculation. The discipline of history prioritizes probability over possibility. Atlantis remains possible, but improbable. The limitation is that probability assessments change with evidence. Public interest ensures Atlantis will remain discussed. This sustains discourse. The limitation is that popularity does not equal validity. The lack of closure is central to Atlantis' endurance. Questions remain open. The limitation is that openness can invite distortion. Atlantis illustrates how narratives survive independently of verification. This separation defines its status. The limitation is unresolved authenticity. No current model fully explains Plato's detailed account without contradiction. This suggests complexity. The limitation is interpretive insufficiency. The debate over Atlantis reveals how history is constructed from fragments. It highlights methodological dependence. The limitation is fragmentary survival. Atlantis continues to be cited as both warning and wonder. These interpretations vary. The limitation is interpretive plurality. The absence of definitive answers reinforces investigative humility. This is a methodological consequence. The limitation is acceptance of uncertainty. Atlantis remains neither confirmed history nor dismissed fiction. It occupies an intermediate category. The limitation is categorical ambiguity. The question of Atlantis persists because it cannot be resolved with existing data. This defines its status. The limitation is evidentiary finality. As long as no new sources emerge, conclusions will remain provisional. This constrains scholarship. The limitation is dependence on chance discovery. Atlantis serves as a reminder of the limits of historical knowledge. Not all pasts are recoverable. The limitation is permanent uncertainty. The mystery endures not because of answers, but because of their absence. This absence defines the investigation. The limitation is unresolved inquiry. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you. The Nazca lines are a series of massive geoglyphs etched into the arid plains of southern Peru, created by removing dark surface stones to reveal lighter ground beneath. These figures include animals, plants, and geometric shapes. Their scale implies intentional planning, while the limitation is that no written records explain their purpose. The geoglyphs are located in the Nazca Desert, a region with extremely low rainfall and stable climate. This environment helped preserve the lines for centuries. The implication is deliberate placement in a unique landscape, but the limitation is that preservation conditions do not clarify original intent. Most of the Nazca lines are dated between 500 BCE and 500 CE, corresponding to the Nazca culture. This dating is supported by pottery styles and radiocarbon analysis of nearby materials. However, none of these methods directly date the lines themselves, limiting chronological certainty. The figures include animals such as hummingbirds, monkeys, spiders, and birds, some stretching hundreds of meters. Their visibility from the ground is limited. This implies a purpose not centered on ground-level observation, while the limitation is that ancient viewing methods remain uncertain. The Nazca people did not possess known technology for aerial observation. This raises questions about how the designs were planned and executed accurately. The limitation is that simple surveying techniques could achieve large-scale precision without advanced tools. Archaeological evidence shows the Nazca culture practiced irrigation, agriculture, and textile production. These activities suggest a complex society capable of coordinated labor. The limitation is that social complexity alone does not explain the symbolic choice of large-scale ground drawings. Some lines extend for kilometers in straight paths across the desert. Their precision implies intentional alignment. The limitation is that straight lines alone do not indicate function, as they could serve multiple symbolic or practical purposes. Early Spanish chroniclers mentioned cleared desert paths, but did not describe the figures in detail. This partial documentation implies limited early recognition. The limitation is that colonial records were incomplete and often dismissive of indigenous practices. The Nazca lines remained largely unknown to the modern world until the 20th century. Their rediscovery coincided with the advent of aviation. This implies that visibility from the air transformed interpretation, while the limitation is projecting modern perspectives onto ancient creators. Archaeologist Toribio Mejia Zespe was among the first to study the lines scientifically in the 1920s. His work framed them as ceremonial pathways. The limitation is that early interpretations lacked extensive comparative data. The Nazca culture did not leave a written language. This absence severely limits direct interpretation. The implication is reliance on material culture alone, while the limitation is interpretive uncertainty. Many geoglyphs are connected by networks of lines forming corridors across the desert. This suggests movement or processional use. The limitation is that wear patterns alone cannot confirm ritual activity. Some lines converge at specific points, possibly indicating focal areas. This implies structured planning. The limitation is that convergence may also result from overlapping construction over time. The desert surface was carefully cleared without disrupting underlying soil layers. This technique minimized erosion. The implication is long-term intention, while the limitation is that durability does not indicate symbolic meaning. Radiocarbon dating of wooden stakes found at line endpoints supports Nazca period construction. This provides indirect evidence. The limitation is that stakes may not correspond to all figures. The scale of labor required suggests communal effort over generations. This implies cultural importance. The limitation is that importance does not equal singular purpose. Some geoglyphs depict animals native to distant ecosystems, such as marine birds. This suggests symbolic representation beyond local environment. The limitation is interpreting symbolism without textual explanation. The orientation of certain lines aligns loosely with solar events. This implies possible astronomical significance. The limitation is that alignments are inconsistent and debated. Other researchers argue the lines relate to water rituals in an arid region. This links imagery to survival concerns. The limitation is lack of direct evidence connecting specific figures to water sources. The Nazca relied heavily on underground aqueducts known as puquillos. This demonstrates sophisticated water management. The limitation is that engineering success does not directly explain geoglyph creation. Some straight lines appear to point toward nearby hills or mountains. This implies landscape integration. The limitation is that directional patterns vary widely. Excavations show Nazca society experienced environmental stress, including drought. This context suggests ritual responses. The limitation is correlating stress with specific artistic expressions. The figures were created over extended periods, not simultaneously. This implies evolving purpose or tradition. The limitation is identifying continuity versus change. No evidence suggests that the Nazca intended the lines to be seen from the sky. This challenges modern assumptions. The limitation is that alternative viewing perspectives remain speculative. The Nazca lines cover hundreds of square kilometers. This scale implies regional coordination. The limitation is that scale alone does not reveal motivation. Despite decades of research, no single theory explains all geoglyph types. This implies complexity. The limitation is fragmentation of interpretations. Modern preservation efforts restrict access to prevent damage. This limits experimental archaeology. The implication is conservation over exploration. The Nazca lines are recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This formal recognition affirms cultural value. The limitation is that designation does not resolve unanswered questions. Scientific analysis continues to refine measurements and mappings. This improves data accuracy. The limitation is that better data has not produced definitive explanations. At this stage of inquiry, the Nazca lines remain a documented cultural achievement with uncertain purpose. The implication is unresolved intent, while the limitation is clear. Without direct testimony, interpretation remains incomplete. One prominent hypothesis interprets the Nazca lines as ceremonial pathways walked during rituals. Archaeologists note worn surfaces along certain lines, suggesting repeated movement. The implication is performative use rather than visual display, while the limitation is that erosion patterns can also result from natural processes over long periods. Ethnographic comparisons with later Andean cultures show ritual movement across sacred landscapes. This provides a contextual framework for interpretation. The limitation is chronological distance, since Nazca culture predates many recorded Andean traditions, making direct cultural continuity uncertain. Astronomical interpretations propose the lines functioned as a large-scale calendar, aligned with solstices and celestial events. Some alignments appear to correspond with solar positions. The limitation is that statistical analysis shows many alignments could occur by chance across numerous lines. Early researchers promoted the idea of astronomical observatories, but later studies challenged their precision. This debate implies evolving methodology. The limitation is that measurement accuracy varies depending on selected reference points and assumptions. Another theory links the lines to water worship, reflecting survival concerns in a desert environment. Imagery of animals associated with rain supports this view. The limitation is the absence of direct archaeological evidence tying specific figures to hydrological features. Excavations near the lines have uncovered ritual offerings, including ceramics and organic remains. These finds suggest ceremonial activity in the region. The limitation is that offerings are not consistently associated with individual geoglyphs. Ground-level visibility studies show that many figures can be perceived from nearby hills. This challenges assumptions about aerial necessity. The limitation is that not all geoglyphs are equally visible from elevated terrain. Experimental archaeology demonstrates that small teams using ropes and stakes can recreate large figures accurately. This implies achievable construction methods. The limitation is that feasibility does not clarify symbolic motivation. The Nazca lines lack defensive or utilitarian features, distinguishing them from infrastructure. This implies non-practical intent. The limitation is that symbolic functions remain broad and undefined. Soil analysis indicates minimal disturbance beneath the cleared lines. This careful technique suggests long-term planning. The limitation is that planning quality does not indicate why the designs were created. Some geoglyphs overlap or intersect, indicating reuse of space over time. This implies evolving traditions. The limitation is determining whether later lines respected or disregarded earlier meanings. Climatic studies show increasing aridity during the Nazca period. This environmental pressure may have influenced ritual expression. The limitation is correlating climate data directly with artistic choices. Iconography on Nazca pottery depicts similar animals to those in the geoglyphs. This suggests shared symbolism across media. The limitation is that pottery scenes do not explain scale or placement. Scholars debate whether the lines served multiple purposes simultaneously. This implies functional plurality. The limitation is that multi-purpose explanations risk becoming unfalsifiable. A minority view suggests the lines marked pilgrimage routes connecting sacred sites. This integrates geography and movement. The limitation is lack of clear destination markers. Remote sensing has identified previously unknown lines, expanding the dataset. This implies the tradition was more extensive than once thought. The limitation is that increased quantity has not clarified purpose. Conservation restrictions limit excavation directly on the lines. This protects the site. The limitation is reduced opportunity for intrusive investigation that might yield new evidence. Interpretations are influenced by modern perspectives on art and symbolism. This raises concerns about projection. The limitation is separating ancient intent from contemporary frameworks. Despite extensive mapping, no central planning hub has been identified. This suggests decentralized creation. The limitation is that organizational structures may leave minimal archaeological trace. Comparative studies with other geoglyph traditions show differences in scale and context. This implies unique cultural expression. The limitation is limited comparative material. Radiocarbon dating continues to refine the construction timeline. This improves chronological resolution. The limitation is indirect association with the lines themselves. Some researchers argue the lines functioned as offerings to deities visible from the sky. This interpretation is symbolic. The limitation is absence of corroborating evidence for sky-oriented worship. The diversity of shapes suggests no single symbolic system. This implies cultural complexity. The limitation is difficulty synthesizing disparate elements into one explanation. Academic consensus increasingly rejects singular explanations. This reflects accumulated evidence. The limitation is that consensus acknowledges uncertainty rather than resolution. Public fascination often emphasizes mystery over method. This affects perception of research. The limitation is misalignment between scholarly caution and popular expectation. Preservation efforts prioritize preventing damage from tourism and development. This ensures survival. The limitation is constrained access for experimental testing. Technological advances continue to improve mapping accuracy. This refines analysis. The limitation is that precision has not produced definitive answers. The Nazca lines remain one of the largest artistic undertakings of the ancient world. This underscores significance. The limitation is that significance does not equate to understanding. Each investigative approach addresses only part of the evidence. This implies fragmented insight. The limitation is integration across disciplines remains incomplete. At this investigative stage, the Nazca lines are understood in form and context, but not intent. The implication is enduring uncertainty, while the limitation remains unchanged. Without direct records, explanations cannot be confirmed. The unresolved purpose of the Nazca Lines highlights a broader challenge in archaeology: interpreting meaning without written explanation. This case demonstrates reliance on indirect evidence. The limitation is that material traces alone rarely capture belief systems or intentions. Comparisons with other ancient monumental projects show that large-scale constructions often served ritual or symbolic roles. This suggests a similar function for the Nazca Lines. The limitation is that comparable sites usually include additional contextual clues absent here. The Nazca Lines differ from monuments designed for permanence, as they rely on fragile surface alteration. This implies meaning tied to place rather than durability. The limitation is that impermanence complicates reconstruction of original use. The sheer number of lines suggests sustained cultural commitment over centuries. This indicates institutional continuity. The limitation is that continuity does not specify whether meanings changed over time. Some lines appear to have been deliberately maintained, indicating ongoing relevance. This implies repeated engagement. The limitation is that maintenance activities leave minimal archaeological signatures. The Nazca culture eventually declined, possibly due to environmental stress. This context raises questions about whether the lines relate to societal response. The limitation is that decline narratives remain debated. Unlike written monuments, the Nazca Lines communicate without text. This suggests a non-linguistic system of meaning. The limitation is deciphering such systems without cultural continuity. The line's visibility from elevated terrain implies engagement with landscape features. This suggests spatial symbolism. The limitation is that symbolic landscapes can be interpreted in multiple ways. The absence of centralized authority markers near the lines challenges hierarchical interpretations. This implies community-based creation. The limitation is that leadership structures may not leave physical evidence. Modern analytical tools quantify patterns, but cannot infer belief. This defines the boundary of scientific inquiry. The limitation is methodological, not technological. The Nazca Lines demonstrate how cultural expression can persist without explicit explanation. This challenges assumptions about historical legibility. The limitation is acceptance of incomplete knowledge. Interpretations often reflect the priorities of the era studying them. This reveals shifting academic frameworks. The limitation is historical interpretation is never static. The lines have survived because of environmental stability, not deliberate preservation. This implies accidental endurance. The limitation is that survival bias affects what is studied. The lack of associated habitation sites near many geoglyphs complicates functional theories. This suggests separation from daily life. The limitation is that ritual spaces often exist apart from settlements. The Nazca Lines occupy a space between art, ritual, and landscape modification. This ambiguity sustains debate. The limitation is definitional overlap. Continued research refines understanding of how the lines were made, not why. This imbalance highlights evidentiary limits. The limitation is explanatory stagnation. The case illustrates how absence of evidence shapes narratives as much as presence. This absence becomes central. The limitation is negative evidence, cannot confirm hypotheses. The Nazca Lines resist singular interpretation because they likely served different roles at different times. This implies dynamic meaning. The limitation is lack of temporal resolution. Public discourse often seeks definitive answers. The Nazca Lines resist closure. The limitation is tension between curiosity and uncertainty. Archaeology accepts uncertainty as part of inquiry. The Nazca Lines exemplify this principle. The limitation is unresolved questions remain. The site continues to be studied using non-invasive methods. This protects integrity. The limitation is restricted intervention. The Nazca Lines challenge modern assumptions about utility and expression. This broadens perspective. The limitation is interpretive openness. No theory has achieved universal acceptance. This reflects evidentiary balance. The limitation is enduring ambiguity. The lines endure as one of the most carefully preserved ancient landscapes. This underscores importance. The limitation is importance does not yield explanation. Each new discovery adds detail, but not resolution. This pattern persists. The limitation is diminishing explanatory returns. The Nazca lines remain a record of action without narrative. This defines their mystery. The limitation is narrative absence. As long as direct testimony is unavailable, interpretation will remain provisional. This constrains conclusions. The limitation is structural. The Nazca lines demonstrate the limits of reconstructing intention from form alone. This informs methodology. The limitation is epistemological. The mystery persists because the evidence allows multiple interpretations, but confirms none. This defines the case. The limitation is unresolved intent. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you. The Library of Alexandria was founded in the early 3rd century BC in the Egyptian city of Alexandria during the reign of Ptolemy I Soter. It was conceived as a center for collecting all known human knowledge. The implication is unprecedented intellectual ambition, while the limitation is uncertainty about its exact structure and scope. Ancient sources describe the library as part of a larger institution known as the Mauseon, dedicated to scholarly research. This implies systematic knowledge production. The limitation is that surviving descriptions are fragmentary and written centuries later. The library reportedly housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls from across the ancient world. This suggests a vast archive of texts. The limitation is that no catalog or inventory has survived to confirm exact numbers or contents. Scrolls were acquired through purchase, copying, and sometimes confiscation from visiting ships. This implies aggressive acquisition policies. The limitation is that such accounts rely on later writers whose accuracy cannot be independently verified. Works collected included philosophy, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and literature. This breadth implies interdisciplinary scholarship. The limitation is that most of these works are known only by later references. Scholars at Alexandria produced critical editions of texts, correcting errors through comparison. This implies early forms of textual criticism. The limitation is that original annotated manuscripts have not survived. The library attracted prominent scholars such as Euclid and Eratosthenes. Their association implies intellectual prestige. The limitation is that their direct use of the library is inferred rather than documented. Eratosthenes famously calculated Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy while working in Alexandria. This suggests access to extensive resources. The limitation is that his methods survive only in secondary descriptions. The library functioned under royal patronage, tying knowledge production to political power. This implies state support. The limitation is vulnerability to political change. Ancient accounts describe the translation of foreign works into Greek, including scientific and religious texts. This implies cross-cultural exchange. The limitation is that few translations can be traced directly to Alexandria. The library existed in a city shaped by conquest and empire. This context implies instability beneath intellectual achievement. The limitation is that political tension threatened long-term continuity. No archaeological remains definitively identified as the Library of Alexandria have been found. This absence limits reconstruction. The implication is reliance on textual sources alone. Ancient writers disagree on the physical layout of the library. Some describe multiple buildings. The limitation is inconsistent testimony. The library's mission to collect all books implies selective judgment over knowledge. This raises questions about inclusion. The limitation is lack of evidence on excluded works. Scrolls were fragile, requiring constant maintenance. This implies labor-intensive preservation. The limitation is susceptibility to fire, humidity, and neglect. Alexandria was a hub of Mediterranean trade. This facilitated knowledge exchange. The limitation is exposure to conflict. Scholars lived and worked within the Mausian, supported by stipends. This implies institutionalized research. The limitation is dependence on royal funding. The library became a symbol of intellectual authority in antiquity. This symbolic role implies influence beyond its walls. The limitation is that symbolism often exceeds reality. Ancient sources do not agree on when the library reached its peak. This creates chronological uncertainty. The limitation is fragmented historical memory. The distinction between the main library and subsidiary collections is unclear. This complicates understanding of loss. The limitation is structural ambiguity. Knowledge in Alexandria was recorded primarily on papyrus scrolls. This medium implies portability. The limitation is extreme vulnerability to destruction. Many works known today only by title were once reportedly housed there. This implies irreversible loss. The limitation is speculative reconstruction. The library operated for centuries, not as a single moment in time. This implies gradual evolution. The limitation is uneven documentation across periods. Some ancient critics question the accuracy of copied texts. This suggests quality control issues. The limitation is lack of surviving originals for comparison. The ambition to centralize knowledge was unprecedented. This implies a unique experiment. The limitation is absence of parallel institutions for comparison. The library's reputation grew after its decline, shaping modern perception. This implies retrospective idealization. The limitation is mythologization. Later generations described the library as irreplaceable. This frames its loss as catastrophic. The limitation is emotional distance from actual events. No contemporary account describes the library's daily operation in detail. This limits practical understanding. The implication is historical opacity. What survives about the library comes from scattered references across centuries. This implies reconstruction from fragments. The limitation is cumulative uncertainty. At this contextual stage, the Library of Alexandria stands as a documented institution of immense ambition, known primarily through absence. The implication is historical loss, while the limitation is clear. Without material remains, certainty is unattainable. One of the earliest accounts of the library's destruction links it to Julius Caesar's campaign in Alexandria. In 48 BCE, ancient writers report a fire spreading from the harbor. The implication is accidental damage, while the limitation is uncertainty about whether the main library or only nearby storage facilities were affected. Caesar himself did not mention the destruction of the library in his writings. This silence raises doubts about the scale of loss. The limitation is that omissions in historical records do not confirm absence of events. Later Roman authors disagree on the extent of damage caused by the fire. Some suggest thousands of scrolls were lost. The limitation is that these accounts were written decades or centuries later. Evidence suggests that Alexandria maintained additional collections beyond the main library. This implies redundancy. The limitation is confusion between multiple institutions when discussing destruction. The Serapeum of Alexandria housed a secondary library. This suggests knowledge survived initial damage. The limitation is lack of detailed inventories. The Serapeum was destroyed in the late 4th century CE during religious conflicts. This provides a documented event of loss. The limitation is uncertainty about how much material remained there at that time. Christian sources describe the destruction of pagan temples, including the Serapeum. This implies ideological conflict. The limitation is bias in surviving narratives. Some historians argue that the library declined gradually rather than being destroyed in a single event. This implies slow erosion of resources. The limitation is difficulty tracing gradual loss archaeologically. Political instability in Ramon, Egypt, affected funding for scholarly institutions. This implies administrative neglect. The limitation is limited documentation of budgets and patronage. Changes in language and scholarly focus reduce demand for older Greek texts. This suggests cultural shift. The limitation is indirect inference. Papyrus scrolls required constant copying to survive. Interruptions in this process imply decay. The limitation is absence of records tracking copying practices. The Muslim conquest of Alexandria in the 7th century is sometimes cited as the final destruction. This claim appears in much later sources. The limitation is lack of contemporary corroboration. Early Islamic historians do not mention the library's destruction. This silence challenges later narratives. The limitation is incomplete historical transmission. Many modern historians reject the idea of a single moment of destruction. This reflects critical reassessment. The limitation is reliance on negative evidence. The loss of the library represents cumulative disappearance rather than a single catastrophe. This reframes the mystery. The limitation is inability to quantify losses. No surviving text can be definitively traced to a scroll copied directly from the library. This limits verification. The implication is total material loss. References to lost works appear in later authors citing earlier texts. This suggests missing intermediaries. The limitation is uncertainty about original content. Scientific treatises known only by title imply gaps in knowledge transmission. This highlights consequence. The limitation is speculative reconstruction of impact. Some historians argue the library's influence is overstated. This challenges popular narratives. The limitation is measuring influence without surviving output. Others maintain that Alexandria shaped foundational scholarship. This implies long-term impact. The limitation is separating library influence from broader Hellenistic culture. The myth of a single burning appeals to narrative simplicity. This explains persistence. The limitation is oversimplification of historical processes. Archaeological excavation in Alexandria is constrained by modern urban development. This limits discovery. The implication is permanent obstruction. Without physical remains, reconstructions rely on literary analysis. This defines methodology. The limitation is interpretive subjectivity. The library's fate illustrates vulnerability of knowledge to political and cultural change. This is a broader implication. The limitation is generalization. No consensus exists on when the library effectively ceased functioning. This reflects ambiguity. The limitation is fragmented chronology. The absence of contemporaneous eyewitness accounts is critical. This restricts certainty. The limitation is reliance on later testimony. Historians must reconcile conflicting sources without material anchors. This complicates analysis. The limitation is evidentiary imbalance. The Library of Alexandria has become symbolic of lost knowledge itself. This shapes interpretation. The limitation is mythologization. Modern discussions often project modern values onto ancient institutions. This risks distortion. The limitation is anachronism. At this investigative stage, the library's disappearance appears gradual, multifaceted, and incomplete in record. The implication is unresolved loss, while the limitation remains the same. The evidence cannot support definitive conclusions. The enduring fascination with the Library of Alexandria reflects a broader anxiety about lost knowledge. It represents what humanity believes may have vanished forever. The limitation is that this perception is shaped more by absence than by measurable historical loss. Comparisons are often made between Alexandria and modern research institutions. This implies continuity of intellectual ambition. The limitation is that ancient scholarly practices differed fundamentally from modern scientific systems. The idea that the library contained revolutionary discoveries is frequently repeated. This suggests transformative potential. The limitation is that no surviving evidence confirms the existence of such advanced or suppressed knowledge. Many texts lost from antiquity disappeared independently of Alexandria. This implies wider systemic loss. The limitation is isolating the library's role from broader patterns of transmission failure. Knowledge survival in antiquity depended on continuous copying. This fragile chain meant interruption led to disappearance. The limitation is that institutional collapse alone does not explain selective survival. Some works survived because they were useful for administration or religion. This implies functional bias. The limitation is that usefulness does not equate to intellectual value. The Library of Alexandria challenges the assumption that progress is cumulative. Knowledge can regress. The limitation is recognizing regression without exaggerating its scope. The loss highlights dependence on material media. Papyrus decay imposed natural limits. The limitation is environmental inevitability. Alexandria's symbolic status grew as physical evidence diminished. This suggests myth formation. The limitation is conflation of symbol and institution. Historical uncertainty surrounding the library illustrates how gaps become narratives. This affects public understanding. The limitation is narrative replacement of evidence. The library's destruction is often invoked as a warning about intolerance. This implies moral lesson. The limitation is attributing intent to complex historical processes. Scholarly caution emphasizes that no single event erased ancient knowledge. This reframes the story. The limitation is loss of dramatic clarity. The absence of definitive answers sustains debate. This keeps the library relevant. The limitation is unresolved inquiry. Alexandria represents both achievement and vulnerability. This duality defines its legacy. The limitation is interpretive breadth. The library's memory persists despite lack of remains. This implies cultural endurance. The limitation is separation from factual certainty. Historical reconstruction depends on probability rather than certainty. Alexandria exemplifies this method. The limitation is acceptance of ambiguity. Each generation reinterprets the library according to contemporary concerns. This shapes discourse. The limitation is shifting frameworks. The Library of Alexandria cannot be fully recovered in fact or meaning. This defines its mystery. The limitation is irreversible loss. What was lost may never be known, only inferred. This constrains speculation. The limitation is epistemic boundary. The library stands as a reminder that preservation is as important as creation. This implication is enduring. The limitation is hindsight. Without physical remains, debate relies on interpretation of texts. This sustains uncertainty. The limitation is textual fragility. Alexandria's story reveals how easily knowledge can disappear. This influences modern archival thinking. The limitation is extrapolation. The mystery persists not because of hidden evidence, but because evidence is gone. This absence defines the case. The limitation is finality. The Library of Alexandria occupies a space between history and memory. This complicates classification. The limitation is categorical ambiguity. Scholars agree on the library's importance, but not its fate. This consensus divergence defines discussion. The limitation is evidentiary insufficiency. The case illustrates the limits of historical reconstruction. Not all losses are recoverable. The limitation is methodological. Alexandria remains a reference point for debates about cultural loss. This sustains relevance. The limitation is symbolic inflation. The lack of closure ensures continued interest. This keeps inquiry alive. The limitation is perpetual uncertainty. The Library of Alexandria endures as an unresolved chapter in human history. Its significance lies in what cannot be confirmed. The limitation is permanent absence. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you. The story of the lost gold of the Incas originates in the final years of the Inca Empire during the Spanish conquest of the 16th century. Large quantities of gold and silver were known to exist. The implication is documented wealth, while the limitation is uncertainty about how much was hidden or removed. The Inca Empire controlled vast mineral resources across the Andes, particularly gold, which held strong symbolic rather than monetary value. This implies centralized accumulation. The limitation is that Inca records relied on oral tradition rather than written inventories. When Spanish forces captured the Inca Emperor Atahualpa in 1532, they demanded an enormous ransom in gold. This demand is historically documented. The limitation is that Spanish accounts vary in describing the amount collected. The ransom reportedly filled a large room with gold and silver objects. This implies extraordinary concentration of wealth. The limitation is that measurements were recorded retrospectively and may have been exaggerated. After Atahualpa was executed despite the ransom, trust between the Incas and Spaniards collapsed. This implies a motive to conceal remaining wealth. The limitation is limited documentation of Inca responses after the execution. Spanish chroniclers noted that large quantities of Inca treasure never reached Spanish hands. This implies intentional concealment. The limitation is distinguishing between lost, hidden, and unrecorded treasure. Inca temples and palaces were described as richly decorated with gold. This suggests widespread use of precious metals. The limitation is that most structures were stripped or destroyed. Gold held religious significance for the Incas, associated with the sun god Inti. This implies ritual importance. The limitation is that religious value complicates assumptions of economic storage. As Spanish control expanded, Inca leaders reportedly ordered treasures to be hidden in remote locations. This implies coordinated action. The limitation is lack of contemporaneous Inca testimony. Oral traditions describe caravans transporting gold into the mountains and forests. This suggests deliberate dispersal. The limitation is reliance on later retellings. The Andes contain vast and inaccessible terrain, including caves, lakes, and high-altitude passes. This geography implies plausible hiding places. The limitation is difficulty verifying specific locations. Some legends associate hidden treasure with sacred sites, implying ritual concealment. The limitation is separating cultural symbolism from physical reality. Spanish expeditions searched for missing treasure shortly after the conquest. This implies belief in its existence. The limitation is that failure to find it does not confirm concealment. Early colonial records reference rumors of vast, undiscovered Inca wealth. This suggests persistent uncertainty. The limitation is the speculative nature of rumors. The destruction of Inca administrative systems disrupted knowledge transmission. This implies loss of information about treasure locations. The limitation is irreversible cultural disruption. Unlike European states, the Incas did not mint coins. This implies wealth existed as objects rather than standardized currency. The limitation is difficulty quantifying total value. Some Inca treasures were melted down by Spaniards, erasing original forms. This implies partial loss. The limitation is inability to trace melted artifacts. The absence of written maps or records complicates modern investigation. This implies reliance on archaeology and legend. The limitation is interpretive uncertainty. Several regions in Peru and Ecuador are associated with treasure legends. This suggests multiple potential sites. The limitation is lack of corroborating evidence. Spanish chroniclers sometimes contradicted one another regarding treasure movements. This inconsistency limits reconstruction. The implication is fragmented testimony. The concept of lost gold may combine multiple events of concealment and seizure. This implies cumulative loss. The limitation is historical conflation. Archaeological excavations have uncovered Inca metalwork, but not in quantities matching legends. This implies partial survival. The limitation is scale mismatch. Some treasures may have been deposited in lakes or rivers to prevent capture. This implies intentional destruction. The limitation is lack of direct evidence. Environmental conditions in the Andes can preserve or destroy metal artifacts differently. This implies uneven survival. The limitation is unpredictable preservation. The Spanish crown kept records of precious metals shipped to Europe. This implies accounting practices. The limitation is that smuggling and loss were common. Estimates of missing Inca gold vary widely among historians. This reflects uncertainty. A limitation is lack of primary data. The narrative of lost treasure became embedded in colonial imagination. This implies myth formation. The limitation is exaggeration over time. The Incas valued gold for ceremonial display rather than accumulation. This complicates assumptions of centralized hoards. The limitation is cultural misunderstanding. No single cache of Inca gold has ever been definitively recovered. This sustains the mystery. The limitation is absence of confirmation. At this contextual stage, the lost gold of the Incas remains defined by documented wealth, colonial disruption, and persistent gaps. The implication is unresolved disappearance, while the limitation is clear. Without records, certainty is unattainable. One of the most persistent legends associated with Inca treasure is the story of a hidden ransom that never reached the Spanish. This implies deliberate concealment during political chaos. The limitation is that the narrative relies on Spanish testimony and later oral traditions, not contemporary Inca records. Some accounts claim that caravans carrying gold toward Cajamarca were diverted after Atahualpa's execution. This suggests last-minute decisions under threat. The limitation is the absence of logistical details confirming such movements. The concept of hidden treasure is often linked to the Inca resistance led by Manco Inca. This implies organized opposition. The limitation is that resistance movements prioritized survival, not preservation of wealth. Manco Inca retreated to the remote region of Vilcabamba, establishing a final Inca stronghold. This location implies secrecy and inaccessibility. The limitation is that Spanish campaigns eventually reached the area without finding major treasure caches. Spanish chroniclers documented continued searches for gold decades after the conquest. This persistence implies belief in its existence. The limitation is that repeated failure suggests exaggerated expectations. Some legends claim treasure was hidden in caves, sealed by collapses or traps. This implies intentional inaccessibility. The limitation is that no verified sealed treasure caves have been discovered. High-altitude Andean lakes are frequently cited as treasure disposal sites. This suggests intentional removal from recovery. The limitation is that underwater archaeology in such environments is extremely limited. Lake Guatavita is often associated with El Dorado rather than Inca gold, but narratives overlap. This implies conflation of different traditions. The limitation is historical blending of unrelated myths. The Spanish practice of torture to extract information about treasure locations is documented. This implies forced disclosure attempts. The limitation is that such methods produced unreliable information. Some Incas may have concealed gold within existing structures. This implies architectural hiding strategies. The limitation is that many structures were dismantled or altered. Earthquakes and landslides are common in the Andes. This suggests possible natural burial of artifacts. The limitation is difficulty distinguishing natural loss from intentional hiding. Archaeological surveys have uncovered small hoards of Inca metal objects. This confirms concealment occurred. The limitation is that these finds are minor compared to legendary quantities. The lack of standardized Inca storage facilities complicates identification of treasury sites. This implies decentralized wealth. The limitation is absence of clear archaeological markers. Spanish legal disputes over treasure ownership indicate uncertainty about total amounts recovered. This implies incomplete extraction. The limitation is biased financial reporting. Some treasure legends emerged long after the conquest, shaped by colonial imagination. This implies narrative inflation. The limitation is unreliable chronology. Modern treasure hunters have pursued Inca gold for centuries. This sustained effort implies belief. The limitation is that none have produced conclusive evidence. National laws restrict excavation and export of artifacts in Peru. This limits exploration. The implication is preservation over discovery. Remote sensing technologies have been applied to suspected sites. This improves detection. The limitation is that metallic artifacts are difficult to identify remotely. The Andes' vastness makes comprehensive surveys impractical. This implies many areas remain unexplored. The limitation is resource constraint. Spanish colonial infrastructure altered landscapes, obscuring earlier contexts. This implies loss of archaeological clarity. The limitation is irreversible modification. Some historians argue most Inca gold was quickly seized or melted. This suggests limited concealment. The limitation is incomplete accounting. Others argue that symbolic value motivated hiding rather than surrender. This implies cultural resistance. The limitation is interpreting intent without direct testimony. The narrative of lost gold persists partly because it aligns with conquest trauma. This gives it emotional resonance. The limitation is psychological bias. Archaeological evidence confirms Inca craftsmanship, but not massive hidden treasuries. This implies discrepancy. The limitation is scale inconsistency. The absence of maps or inscriptions referencing treasure locations remains central. This blocks verification. The limitation is evidentiary silence. Some sites associated with treasure legends show no Inca occupation. This challenges claims. The limitation is misattribution. Colonial-era maps sometimes marked vague gold regions. This implies rumor-driven cartography. The limitation is lack of precision. The line between historical loss and legendary exaggeration remains unclear. This sustains debate. The limitation is narrative distortion. No single hypothesis explains all accounts of missing Inca gold. This implies fragmentation. The limitation is conflicting evidence. At this investigative stage, the lost gold of the Incas appears shaped by documented wealth, chaotic conquest, and unreliable transmission. The implication is enduring uncertainty, while the limitation remains. Material confirmation is absent. The enduring appeal of lost Inca gold reflects a broader human fixation on vanished wealth. This fascination shapes modern expectations of discovery. The limitation is that cultural interest does not increase the likelihood of physical recovery. Comparisons with other historical treasure losses show that most large hoards are eventually documented or recovered. This suggests rarity. The limitation is that unique conquest conditions may have altered typical outcomes. The Incas' non-monetary view of gold complicates assumptions about storage and accounting. This implies decentralized handling. The limitation is difficulty applying European economic logic to Inca practices. Oral tradition played a central role in preserving Inca history. This implies continuity of memory. The limitation is that oral narratives evolve and cannot be dated precisely. Spanish narratives often frame missing gold as evidence of deceit or rebellion. This implies bias. The limitation is distorted interpretation of Inca actions. The Andes geography continues to limit archaeological access. This implies potential undiscovered sites. The limitation is that potential alone cannot support conclusions. Advances in archaeological methods improve detection of buried artifacts. This suggests future possibilities. The limitation is that gold objects are often isolated rather than concentrated. Legal and ethical considerations restrict excavation of sacred sites. This preserves heritage. The limitation is reduced investigative scope. The loss of Inca gold is inseparable from the broader collapse of Inca society. This implies cultural consequence. The limitation is separating symbolic loss from material loss. Some scholars argue that focusing on gold obscures more significant losses, such as knowledge and social structure. This reframes importance. The limitation is shifting investigative focus. The legend persists partly because it lacks resolution. This sustains narrative power. The limitation is circular reinforcement. Archaeological evidence suggests that many Inca ritual objects were deliberately destroyed. This implies intentional erasure. The limitation is incomplete documentation. Modern national identity in the Andes interacts with treasure narratives. This influences interpretation. The limitation is contemporary projection. The story of lost gold often overshadows documented exploitation by colonial forces. This affects historical balance. The limitation is narrative simplification. The absence of definitive discoveries reinforces skepticism among historians. This shapes consensus. The limitation is reliance on negative evidence. Some treasure sites may lie beyond current technological reach. This implies uncertainty. The limitation is speculative reach. The Inca gold narrative illustrates how material loss becomes symbolic over time. This shapes memory. The limitation is separation from verifiable fact. The continued search reflects unresolved historical trauma rather than empirical expectation. This reframes motivation. The limitation is interpretive inference. As time passes, the probability of recovery decreases due to environmental and human factors. This constrains outcomes. The limitation is temporal erosion. The story persists because it sits at the intersection of history, loss, and imagination. This sustains attention. The limitation is blurred boundaries. Archaeology prioritizes evidence over legend. This defines methodology. The limitation is that legend often outpaces discovery. The absence of closure leaves room for reinterpretation. This keeps inquiry open. The limitation is lack of resolution. The lost gold of the Incas remains part of historical discourse because it cannot be conclusively resolved. This defines its status. The limitation is evidentiary finality. The narrative continues to attract investigation despite diminishing returns. This implies persistence. The limitation is expectation versus reality. Scholars increasingly view the legend as a product of conquest disruption rather than secret hoards. This shifts understanding. The limitation is incomplete proof. The case demonstrates how history can be shaped by what is missing rather than what survives. This is a broader implication. The limitation is methodological constraint. Without new primary evidence, interpretations will remain provisional. This constrains conclusions. The limitation is dependence on chance discovery. The lost gold functions as a symbol of irreversible cultural upheaval. This broadens meaning. The limitation is symbolic abstraction. The mystery endures not because gold has been found, but because its absence remains unexplained. This absence defines the case. The limitation is unresolved inquiry. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you. The story of the lost army of Cambyses originates from the account of the Greek historian Herodotus. Writing in the 5th century BCE, he describes a Persian force that vanished in the Egyptian desert. The implication is a documented disappearance, while the limitation is reliance on a single ancient source. According to Herodotus, King Cambyses II of Persia sent an army of approximately 50,000 soldiers toward the Siwa oasis. This implies a large-scale military operation. The limitation is that Herodotus wrote decades after the events he described. The Persian Empire at the time controlled vast territories, making such expeditions plausible. This supports logistical feasibility. The limitation is that imperial capacity does not confirm the specific mission described. Herodotus states that the army disappeared after being caught in a massive sandstorm. This implies a natural cause. The limitation is that no physical evidence has confirmed such an event affecting a force of that size. The Siwa oasis was a known religious center, home to the Oracle of Amun. This suggests a political or religious motive for the expedition. The limitation is uncertainty about Cambyses' intentions. Ancient sources outside Herodotus do not mention the lost army. This absence raises questions about corroboration. The limitation is that many Persian records have not survived. The desert between the Nile Valley and Siwa is harsh and difficult to navigate. This environment implies high risk for large troop movements. The limitation is that experienced armies often adapted to desert travel. Persian military logistics relied on supply lines and local support. This suggests planning. The limitation is that disruption of supplies could have catastrophic consequences. The scale of the reported army implies significant archaeological traces. This creates an investigative expectation. The limitation is that desert conditions can rapidly obscure evidence. Sandstorms in the Sahara are capable of burying objects quickly. This supports Herodotus' explanation. The limitation is that complete burial of an entire army remains unverified. Some scholars question the reported number of soldiers, suggesting exaggeration. This implies narrative inflation. The limitation is lack of alternative figures. Cambyses too is portrayed in ancient sources as volatile and impious. This characterization implies reckless decision-making. The limitation is potential bias in Greek portrayals of Persian rulers. The Persian invasion of Egypt is well documented. This confirms Cambyses' presence in the region. The limitation is connecting this campaign directly to the lost army narrative. The route from Thebes to Siwa would have required precise navigation. This implies local guides. The limitation is absence of records identifying such guides. Herodotus describes the army stopping at an oasis before vanishing. This implies a traceable path. The limitation is that the specific oasis is not clearly identified. No contemporary Egyptian sources describe the disappearance. This silence complicates verification. The limitation is loss of local records. Some historians argue the account may serve as a cautionary tale about hubris. This implies moral framing. The limitation is separating allegory from history. The lack of Persian inscriptions referencing the expedition raises doubts. This implies omission. The limitation is selective survival of records. Archaeological surveys in the Western Desert have been limited by terrain and scale. This restricts discovery. The limitation is incomplete exploration. The desert landscape changes over time due to wind and erosion. This implies potential loss of evidence. The limitation is unpredictability of preservation. Ancient military disasters were sometimes downplayed or omitted from official records. This implies intentional silence. The limitation is speculative inference. Herodotus' work blends inquiry with storytelling. This complicates interpretation. The limitation is assessing historical accuracy. Despite doubts, the account persisted across centuries. This implies enduring credibility. The limitation is repetition does not equal verification. The lost army narrative has influenced modern exploration efforts. This implies continued interest. The limitation is that exploration has not produced confirmation. Modern scholars debate whether the army truly vanished or was defeated by human forces. This introduces alternative explanations. The limitation is lack of evidence for conflict. The desert contains ancient caravan routes. This suggests possible misdirection rather than disappearance. The limitation is absence of material traces. Climate studies show desert conditions could have been severe during the period. This supports environmental hazard. The limitation is correlating climate data with a single event. The story's simplicity contrasts with complex military realities. This raises skepticism. The limitation is narrative compression. No mass graves or weapon caches have been definitively linked to the lost army. This absence sustains mystery. The limitation is incomplete coverage. At this contextual stage, the lost army of Cambyses remains defined by a single ancient account, plausible environmental danger, and missing evidence. The implication is unresolved disappearance, while the limitation is clear. Confirmation remains elusive. Modern investigations into the lost army of Cambyses attempt to reconcile Herodotus' account with geography and environmental science. This implies interdisciplinary analysis. The limitation is that modern methods still rely on an ancient narrative as the starting point. Satellite imagery has been used to identify potential ancient routes across the Western Desert. This suggests possible paths taken by the army. The limitation is that route identification does not confirm presence of troops. Some researchers propose that the army followed established caravan tracks towards Siwa. This implies logistical planning. The limitation is that such routes shifted over time and left minimal durable traces. Geological studies confirm that powerful sandstorms can drastically alter desert landscapes. This supports the plausibility of sudden burial. The limitation is that no verified case demonstrates complete erasure of a force of this size. Alternative theories suggest the army was ambushed by local forces or rival groups. This implies human conflict rather than natural disaster. The limitation is absence of weapons, fortifications, or battle remains. The Western Desert contained nomadic groups capable of resisting intrusion. This suggests potential opposition. The limitation is lack of historical records describing such an engagement. Some scholars argue the army may have become disoriented and fragmented rather than destroyed at once. This implies gradual loss. The limitation is that fragmentation would likely leave dispersed evidence. Ancient military failures were sometimes transformed into moral narratives. This implies Herodotus' account may carry symbolic weight. The limitation is determining the balance between symbolism and reporting. Excavations in suspected regions have uncovered isolated artifacts from various periods. This suggests long-term human presence. The limitation is none can be conclusively linked to Persian soldiers. The Persian military used standardized equipment and materials. This implies identifiable artifacts should exist. The limitation is that metal and organic materials degrade differently in desert conditions. Some expeditions claim to have found remains of weapons or bones. This implies possible discovery. The limitation is that none have been independently verified or dated to the Persian period. The vast search area complicates systematic excavation. This implies logistical constraints. The limitation is that incomplete surveys leave large gaps. Political instability and modern borders restrict access to some regions. This limits fieldwork. The limitation is reduced investigation capacity. Critics argue Herodotus may have relied on secondhand stories. This implies hearsay. The limitation is that his work often blends verified observation with reported accounts. Persian royal inscriptions typically celebrated victories, not defeats. This implies omission of failures. The limitation is that silence does not confirm the event. Some historians suggest the army never existed as described. This implies narrative invention. The limitation is lack of evidence either way. Climate reconstructions indicate shifting desert margins over millennia. This suggests possible burial under dunes. The limitation is difficulty locating ancient surfaces. The story's endurance has fueled repeated expeditions. This implies persistent belief. The limitation is absence of tangible results. Archaeological methodology favors sites with clear contextual indicators. The lost army lacks such markers. The limitation is methodological exclusion. The desert's capacity to preserve or destroy evidence is inconsistent. This implies uneven survival. The limitation is unpredictability. Some modern analyses reinterpret the event as a smaller detachment rather than a full army. This reduces expected evidence. The limitation is speculative revision. Mapping ancient water sources suggests survival may have been possible longer than assumed. This challenges sudden annihilation. The limitation is that survival does not explain disappearance. The lack of burial practices evidence complicates casualty explanations. This implies abrupt loss. The limitation is incomplete understanding of Persian desert warfare. Technological advances continue to refine desert surveying. This suggests future potential. The limitation is diminishing probability over time. Academic consensus remains divided on literal versus symbolic interpretation. This reflects evidentiary ambiguity. The limitation is unresolved debate. The case highlights reliance on narrative in absence of artifacts. This defines its status. The limitation is evidentiary imbalance. The lost army of Cambyses remains a boundary case between history and legend. This complicates classification. The limitation is categorical uncertainty. No definitive discovery has altered understanding in recent decades. This suggests stagnation. The limitation is dependence on chance finds. The mystery persists because plausible explanations lack confirmation. This sustains inquiry. The limitation is unresolved verification. At this investigative stage, the disappearance of Cambyses' army remains unexplained by material evidence. The implication is enduring uncertainty, while the limitation remains unchanged. Without artifacts, conclusions cannot be secured. The continued absence of physical evidence has shaped modern interpretation of the lost army. Scholars increasingly focus on methodological limits rather than definitive answers. The implication is a shift in inquiry, while the limitation is that reframing does not resolve the original disappearance. Comparisons with other ancient military losses show that most leave archaeological traces. This contrast heightens the anomaly. The limitation is that desert environments behave differently from other landscapes. The scale of the alleged force remains central to skepticism. A large army should leave significant material remains. The limitation is that the reported number may be inaccurate. If the army fragmented, survivors might have integrated into local populations. This implies assimilation rather than annihilation. The limitation is lack of cultural or genetic evidence supporting this outcome. The narrative persists partly because it resists closure. This sustains historical interest. The limitation is that unresolved stories can drift toward speculation. Modern explorers often approach the story with expectations shaped by Herodotus. This influences search strategies. The limitation is confirmation bias. Advances in remote sensing may yet reveal buried evidence. This suggests future possibility. The limitation is that technological promise does not guarantee discovery. The Lost Army illustrates how single-source accounts shape historical memory. This highlights vulnerability in historiography. The limitation is dependence on limited testimony. The case underscores the importance of corroboration in ancient history. Without it, certainty remains elusive. The limitation is that corroboration may no longer be possible. Some historians treat the account as a warning against overconfidence in imperial power. This implies moral framing. The limitation is separating lesson from fact. The disappearance has become emblematic of nature's dominance over human ambition. This interpretation persists culturally. The limitation is symbolic emphasis. Archaeology accepts that some events leave no recoverable trace. This acknowledges limits. The limitation is acceptance without resolution. The desert's silence reinforces uncertainty. Evidence may exist beyond reach. The limitation is physical inaccessibility. Each failed search narrows expectations, but does not eliminate possibility. This sustains inquiry. The limitation is diminishing likelihood. The Lost Army challenges assumptions about historical completeness. Not all events are recoverable. The limitation is epistemological. Herodotus' credibility remains debated across his work. This affects interpretation. The limitation is evaluating accuracy without comparison. The story continues to be cited in discussions of ancient exploration and risk. This extends relevance. The limitation is reliance on unresolved cases. The disappearance reflects broader patterns of loss in ancient records. This contextualizes the mystery. The limitation is cumulative absence. The army's fate remains unknown despite centuries of inquiry. This defines the case. The limitation is absence of closure. Modern scholarship prioritizes probability over certainty. In this case, probability remains unclear. The limitation is ambiguous weighting of evidence. The lost army stands as a reminder of history's gaps. Some questions persist indefinitely. The limitation is acceptance of uncertainty. Without new material discoveries, interpretations will remain provisional. This constrains future work. The limitation is dependence on chance. The case highlights how environment, narrative, and power intersect in historical memory. This broadens understanding. The limitation is generalization. The disappearance has influenced both academic and popular imagination. This sustains attention. The limitation is divergence between interest and evidence. Scholars agree that the event cannot currently be confirmed or dismissed. This consensus reflects restraint. The limitation is unresolved status. The lost army of Cambyses remains suspended between explanation and doubt. This defines its place in history. The limitation is evidentiary silence. The mystery endures because available data supports multiple interpretations. None can be proven. The limitation is interpretive balance. History sometimes preserves events through absence rather than record. This case exemplifies that principle. The limitation is permanent uncertainty. The disappearance continues to be studied not for answers, but for what it reveals about historical limits. This reframes significance. The limitation is unresolved outcome. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you. Stonehenge is a prehistoric monument located on Salisbury Plain in southern England. Constructed in multiple phases beginning around 3000 BCE, its massive stone arrangement implies deliberate planning and long-term effort. The limitation is that no written records from its builders exist to explain its purpose or construction methods. The site consists of large standing stones arranged in circular and horseshoe patterns, including sarsen stones weighing up to 25 tons. This scale implies advanced organizational capability. The limitation is uncertainty about how Neolithic societies coordinated such labor without metal tools or wheels. Archaeological evidence indicates Stonehenge was built over more than 1,000 years. This suggests cultural continuity across generations. The limitation is that changing builders may have altered intentions, complicating interpretation. The largest stones, known as sarsens, were sourced from Marlborough Downs, approximately 30 kilometers away. This implies intentional long-distance transport. The limitation is lack of direct evidence showing the exact transportation methods used. Smaller bluestones originated in the Preseli Hills of Wales, over 200 kilometers from Stonehenge. This implies extraordinary logistical effort. The limitation is that the route and means of transport remain debated. Experimental archaeology has shown that stones of this size can be moved using wooden sledges and rollers. This demonstrates feasibility. The limitation is that modern experiments rely on assumptions about ancient labor organization. No definitive tools used specifically for stone transport have been found at the site. This absence limits reconstruction. The implication is reliance on indirect inference. The stones were shaped with remarkable precision, including mortise and tenon joints. This implies sophisticated craftsmanship. The limitation is that the tools capable of such precision have not been conclusively identified. Stonehenge's layout aligns with the solstices, particularly the summer solstice sunrise. This suggests astronomical significance. The limitation is that alignment alone does not confirm ritual intent. Similar stone circles exist across Britain, indicating a broader cultural tradition. This implies Stonehenge was part of a larger pattern. The limitation is that Stonehenge's scale and complexity exceed most other sites. Excavations reveal human burials near Stonehenge, suggesting funerary use. This implies ritual importance. The limitation is that burials occurred over extended periods, not necessarily during construction. Animal bones and feasting remains found nearby suggest large gatherings. This implies communal events. The limitation is that feasting does not clarify the monument's primary function. Stonehenge was built in an open landscape with long sidelines. This implies intentional placement. The limitation is uncertainty about how the surrounding environment influenced meaning. The monument's stones were rearranged multiple times. This implies evolving purpose. The limitation is that motives behind redesign remain unknown. No definitive evidence links Stonehenge to a specific deity or belief system. This limits religious interpretation. The implication is interpretive restraint. Radiocarbon dating of nearby features provides approximate construction timelines. This supports chronology. The limitation is indirect association with the stones themselves. The effort required to build Stonehenge suggests social cooperation on a large scale. This implies organized leadership. The limitation is absence of evidence identifying such leadership. Some researchers propose Stonehenge served as a healing site based on human remains showing injuries. This implies therapeutic significance. The limitation is correlational rather than causal evidence. Others argue it functioned as a ceremonial center for regional populations. This implies social integration. The limitation is lack of direct testimony. Stonehenge's enduring presence indicates long-term cultural importance. This implies sustained relevance. The limitation is that longevity does not explain original intent. The surrounding area contains numerous other monuments, including burial mounds and avenues. This suggests a ritual landscape. The limitation is disentangling relationships among sites. Construction required significant resource investment. This implies prioritization over daily subsistence. The limitation is unclear economic impact. The monument's design reflects both engineering and symbolic considerations. This implies multifaceted purpose. The limitation is isolating each function. Stonehenge's stones show evidence of deliberate placement and leveling. This implies planning accuracy. The limitation is lack of construction diagrams or plans. Weathering patterns suggest stones stood upright shortly after placement. This implies stability. The limitation is inability to reconstruct exact erection techniques. Some stones were removed or toppled in antiquity. This implies later alteration. The limitation is uncertainty about reasons for removal. Archaeological interpretation relies heavily on material remains. Stonehenge offers limited artifacts. This constrains analysis. Despite extensive study, Stonehenge resists definitive explanation. This sustains debate. The limitation is evidentiary scarcity. Public fascination often exceeds scholarly certainty. This influences perception. The limitation is separating myth from evidence. At this contextual stage, Stonehenge stands as a documented engineering achievement with unresolved methods and purpose. The implication is enduring uncertainty, while the limitation remains clear. The builders left no direct explanation. Investigations into Stonehenge increasingly focus on how Neolithic communities organized labor over long periods. This implies social coordination beyond small kin groups. The limitation is that social structures leave minimal direct archaeological traces. Evidence from nearby settlements suggests seasonal occupation by large groups. This implies periodic gatherings for construction or ritual. The limitation is that settlement remains do not specify activities at the monument. Transporting sarsen stones likely required coordinated teams using ropes and wooden frameworks. This suggests engineering knowledge. The limitation is that organic materials rarely survive, leaving reconstruction speculative. The Bluestones movement from Wales raises questions about motivation, not just capability. This implies symbolic value. The limitation is lack of consensus on why these specific stones were chosen. Isotopic analysis of human remains indicates people traveled long distances to the region. This implies Stonehenge attracted non-local populations. The limitation is that travel reasons cannot be directly inferred. Some researchers argue Stonehenge marked territorial boundaries. This implies political function. The limitation is that boundary markers typically show clear spatial patterns. Acoustic studies suggest the stone arrangement alters sound perception. This implies experiential design. The limitation is that acoustic effects may be incidental rather than intentional. The alignment with solar events has been statistically evaluated, showing intentional orientation. This implies astronomical awareness. The limitation is that awareness does not explain broader architectural choices. Stonehenge's construction coincided with shifts in burial practices in Britain. This suggests cultural transition. The limitation is establishing causation rather than correlation. Excavations reveal earlier timber structures on the site. This implies continuity of sacred space. The limitation is that timber phases are less well preserved. The stone's precise shaping indicates planning before transport. This implies advanced foresight. The limitation is absence of evidence showing where shaping occurred. Wear patterns on tools found nearby suggest stoneworking activity. This supports construction hypotheses. The limitation is linking tools directly to Stonehenge. Some scholars propose Stonehenge functioned as a calendar. This implies practical application. The limitation is that simpler calendars existed without monumental architecture. The monument's visual dominance in the landscape implies symbolic power. This suggests social messaging. The limitation is interpreting intended audience. Comparative studies with European megalithic sites show shared techniques. This implies cultural exchange. The limitation is variability in local adaptations. Radiocarbon dating shows overlapping phases of activity. This implies continuous use. The limitation is distinguishing construction from later modification. The absence of domestic structures nearby suggests Stonehenge was not residential. This implies specialized use. The limitation is defining that use precisely. Some interpretations emphasize ancestor veneration. This implies ritual continuity. The limitation is lack of direct symbolic artifacts. The scale of effort suggests Stonehenge served a purpose significant enough to justify resource investment. This implies high value. The limitation is subjective assessment of value. Modern reconstructions often rely on idealized scenarios. This introduces bias. The limitation is projecting coherence onto fragmented evidence. Stonehenge's stones show evidence of repair and repositioning. This implies maintenance. The limitation is understanding maintenance motivations. Climatic conditions during construction were relatively stable. This implies environmental feasibility. The limitation is that climate alone does not explain monumentality. The monument's orientation remained consistent across phases. This implies persistent symbolic reference. The limitation is interpreting that reference. Some researchers suggest Stonehenge represented unity among dispersed groups. This implies social integration. The limitation is absence of supporting inscriptions. Archaeological narratives evolve as new data emerges. This implies interpretive fluidity. The limitation is lack of decisive evidence. Stonehenge's enduring mystery partly results from selective preservation. Stone remains survive. Organic context does not. The limitation is evidentiary imbalance. Public reconstructions often emphasize spectacle over process. This affects perception. The limitation is conflation of entertainment with scholarship. The monument has been studied for centuries, yet questions persist. This implies complexity. The limitation is diminishing explanatory returns. No single theory accounts for all features of Stonehenge. This implies multifunctionality. The limitation is risk of unfalsifiable explanations. At this investigative stage, Stonehenge's construction methods are partially understood, but motivations remain uncertain. The implication is ongoing inquiry, while the limitation persists. Material evidence cannot fully explain intent. The persistence of unanswered questions about Stonehenge reflects broader limits in interpreting prehistoric societies. Without written language, meaning must be inferred indirectly. The limitation is that inference cannot fully replace direct explanation. Stonehenge is often compared to other ancient engineering feats, yet it differs in scale and context. This suggests unique regional expression. The limitation is that uniqueness complicates comparative analysis. The monument's long construction timeline implies that its significance endured beyond its original builders. This suggests cultural inheritance. The limitation is uncertainty about how later communities understood the site. Some scholars argue Stonehenge's importance lay in process rather than final form. This implies meaning in participation. The limitation is that process leaves few material traces. The effort invested in transporting stones over long distances implies deliberate choice rather than convenience. This suggests symbolic motivation. The limitation is inability to identify that symbolism. Stonehenge's visibility from afar may have served as a landmark. This implies navigational or territorial significance. The limitation is lack of corroborating evidence. The monument's survival contrasts with the disappearance of many contemporary wooden structures. This affects interpretation. The limitation is preservation bias. Archaeological interpretation must account for both engineering feasibility and cultural context. This duality shapes debate. The limitation is incomplete contextual data. Stonehenge's alignment with celestial events has remained consistent over millennia. This suggests enduring reference points. The limitation is explaining why those events mattered socially. The absence of domestic debris reinforces the idea of special purpose use. This implies separation from everyday life. The limitation is defining that special purpose. Modern technologies have refined measurements but not resolved meaning. This highlights methodological boundaries. The limitation is that precision does not equal understanding. Stonehenge continues to attract interdisciplinary study. This reflects its complexity. The limitation is that multiple disciplines yield divergent conclusions. The monument has been reinterpreted repeatedly across centuries. This suggests adaptive meaning. The limitation is disentangling ancient intent from later reinterpretation. Stonehenge's role in popular imagination often exceeds scholarly certainty. This affects public understanding. The limitation is managing expectation versus evidence. The site's protected status restricts invasive research. This preserves integrity. The limitation is constrained investigation. Stonehenge exemplifies how monumental architecture can outlast its cultural explanation. This defines its mystery. The limitation is irreversible loss of context. Archaeological consensus accepts partial answers rather than definitive conclusions. This reflects methodological caution. The limitation is unresolved core questions. The monument's builders likely possessed knowledge systems now lost. This implies cognitive complexity. The limitation is inability to reconstruct those systems. Stonehenge's continued study reveals as much about modern inquiry as ancient practice. This is a meta-implication. The limitation is reflexive bias. The absence of a singular explanation sustains scholarly debate. This keeps the site relevant. The limitation is perpetual uncertainty. Stonehenge remains a case study in interpreting material culture without narrative. This shapes methodology. The limitation is evidentiary silence. Each proposed explanation addresses some features while leaving others unexplained. This suggests incomplete models. The limitation is fragmented understanding. The monument challenges assumptions about technological capability in prehistory. This broadens perspective. The limitation is avoiding anachronism. Stonehenge's endurance underscores the power of collective effort. This implies social cohesion. The limitation is inferring cohesion without records. The site continues to resist reduction to a single function. This defines its complexity. The limitation is explanatory insufficiency. Stonehenge occupies a boundary between engineering, ritual, and landscape design. This complicates classification. The limitation is categorical overlap. The lack of closure ensures ongoing investigation. This sustains interest. The limitation is acceptance of incomplete answers. Stonehenge illustrates how some historical questions remain open-ended. This informs historical humility. The limitation is epistemological. The monument endures not because it is understood, but because it is not. This absence defines the mystery. The limitation is unresolved intent. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you. The Screaming Mummy of Egypt refers to a mummified individual discovered in the late 19th century, whose mouth was found wide open, creating a striking expression. This physical condition is documented. The implication is an unusual burial outcome, while the limitation is that facial appearance alone does not explain cause. The mummy was discovered in a cache of royal mummies at Deir el-Bahari, near Thebes, now Luxor. This context implies high-status burial association. The limitation is that secondary reburial complicates original burial interpretation. Unlike most Egyptian mummies, this individual was not wrapped carefully in fine linens. This implies deviation from standard mortuary practice. The limitation is uncertainty about whether this deviation was intentional or circumstantial. The mummy's jaw was not bound shut, which contrasts with typical mummification methods. This suggests a deliberate choice or omission. The limitation is that preservation conditions can affect soft tissues post-burial. Early examinations noted the presence of resin inside the body, but irregular application. This implies partial mummification. The limitation is that early documentation lacked modern forensic standards. The open mouth created speculation about death by pain or suffocation. This implication arises visually. The limitation is that rigor mortis and dehydration can produce similar appearances. Egyptian mummification rituals were designed to preserve the body for the afterlife. Deviation implies social or ritual significance. The limitation is absence of explicit textual explanation. The mummy was wrapped in sheepskin, a material considered ritually impure in ancient Egypt. This implies punishment or exclusion. The limitation is limited comparative evidence for such usage. The sheepskin covering contrasts with linen used for honored dead. This suggests symbolic treatment. The limitation is that practical reuse of materials cannot be ruled out. No inscriptions identifying the individual were found with the mummy. This absence limits identification. The implication is anonymity within a royal cache, while the limitation is missing labels. Radiocarbon dating places the mummy in the New Kingdom period. This situates it historically. The limitation is that dating does not indicate identity or cause of death. The mummy's discovery among royal remains suggests intentional placement. This implies political or protective motives. The limitation is that reburial practices obscure original context. Some researchers propose the mummy may belong to a royal figure punished posthumously. This implies judicial action. The limitation is lack of definitive inscriptions confirming such punishment. Egyptian texts describe executions and dishonorable burials for traitors. This provides cultural context. The limitation is linking texts to this specific case. The absence of the heart, typically preserved, implies ritual deviation. This suggests symbolic erasure. The limitation is uncertainty about whether the heart was removed intentionally. CT scans reveal the mummy was embalmed, but not eviscerated in the usual manner. This implies deliberate alteration of ritual. The limitation is interpreting intention from physical evidence alone. The open mouth may result from dehydration after death, rather than expression at death. This offers a natural explanation. The limitation is incomplete soft tissue preservation. Early museum descriptions sensationalized the mummy's appearance. This influenced public perception. The limitation is separating spectacle from evidence. The mummy's teeth and jaw show no signs of violent trauma. This challenges assumptions of torture. The limitation is that some causes of death leave no skeletal trace. Chemical analysis shows resin was poured into the mouth and throat. This implies ritual action. The limitation is that the purpose of this action is debated. The use of resin may have served preservation rather than punishment. This complicates interpretation. The limitation is lack of parallel examples. The mummy's posture and treatment differ from other royal mummies. This implies special status. The limitation is ambiguity of that status. Egyptian beliefs emphasized proper burial to ensure afterlife. Deviation implies denial or modification of afterlife access. The limitation is interpreting belief from material deviation. The mummy was later unwrapped and rewrapped multiple times. This affects condition. The limitation is modern intervention altering evidence. Some scholars argue the mummy represents a case of political retribution. This implies historical conflict. The limitation is absence of corroborating records. Others interpret the mummy as an example of unusual embalming technique. This suggests experimentation. The limitation is rarity of such methods. Advances in imaging have refined understanding of the mummy's condition. This improves analysis. The limitation is that technology cannot recover lost context. The screaming mummy challenges assumptions about uniformity in Egyptian burial practices. This broadens interpretation. The limitation is limited sample size. Despite extensive study, the mummy's identity and treatment remain uncertain. This sustains debate. The limitation is evidentiary silence. At this contextual stage, the screaming mummy of Egypt is defined by documented physical anomalies, cultural deviation, and unresolved interpretation. The implication is enduring mystery, while the limitation remains clear. Material evidence cannot fully explain intent. Modern forensic analysis has shifted focus from visual appearance to internal evidence. CT scans allow non-invasive examination of bones and tissues. This implies more reliable interpretation, while the limitation is that imaging cannot determine emotional states or exact circumstances of death. Analysis of the jaw position suggests it may have dropped naturally after death. This challenges the assumption of agony at the moment of death. The limitation is that post-mortem changes vary depending on environment and handling. The absence of binding to secure the jaw is unusual but not unique. Some mummies show similar features due to embalming variation. The limitation is that variation alone does not explain why this individual was treated differently. Chemical residue inside the mouth indicates hot resin was poured during embalming. This suggests intentional ritual action. The limitation is uncertainty about whether this act was symbolic, practical, or punitive. The use of resin could have preserved facial features by stabilizing soft tissue. This implies technical reasoning. The limitation is that this method was rarely used, offering little comparative data. The sheepskin wrapping remains one of the most distinctive features. In ancient Egyptian belief, sheepskin was considered ritually impure. This implies dishonor. The limitation is that evidence for consistent symbolic meaning of sheepskin is limited. Some scholars propose the mummy represents a criminal denied full burial rites. This aligns with textual references to punishment. The limitation is that no legal records identify such an individual. DNA analysis has been attempted to identify lineage. This implies potential royal connection. The limitation is that DNA preservation is incomplete and results remain inconclusive. One hypothesis identifies the mummy as a son of Rameses III involved in a palace conspiracy. This implies political execution. The limitation is that genetic evidence does not definitively confirm identity. Egyptian records describe conspiracies punished with death and ritual degradation. This supports contextual plausibility. The limitation is absence of explicit mention of this burial. The mummy's placement among honored royal remains complicates the punishment theory. This implies protection rather than disgrace. The limitation is reconciling placement with treatment. Reburial of mummies during later periods aimed to protect royal bodies from tomb robbers. This implies practical motivation. The limitation is loss of original burial context. differences between original burial and later rewrapping obscure interpretation. This limits certainty. The implication is layered historical interference. Skeletal analysis shows no evidence of strangulation or broken bones. This narrows causes of death. The limitation is that poison or natural causes may leave no trace. The dramatic appearance has influenced popular narratives more than scientific evidence. This implies perception bias. The limitation is public focus on imagery over data. The mummy's teeth show signs of normal wear, suggesting adult age. This implies maturity. The limitation is broad age estimation. Absence of grave goods typically associated with elite burials suggests atypical status. This implies social deviation. The limitation is incomplete burial inventories. Some Egyptologists caution against over-interpreting anomalies. This implies methodological restraint. The limitation is that restraint leaves questions unanswered. The screaming mummy illustrates how ritual variation can be misread as violence. This challenges assumptions. The limitation is distinguishing intention from outcome. Scientific testing has ruled out several sensational claims. This narrows explanation space. The limitation is that remaining possibilities are still speculative. The case highlights the importance of context in funerary archaeology. Removal from original context reduces interpretive power. The limitation is irreversible displacement. Comparative analysis with other unusual mummies reveals no exact parallels. This implies uniqueness. The limitation is lack of a control sample. The mummy's condition suggests deliberate choices were made during embalming. This implies agency. The limitation is not knowing whose agency or purpose. Advances in forensic Egyptology continue to refine interpretation. This suggests progress. The limitation is diminishing returns without new data. The mummy remains housed in museum collections under controlled conditions. This preserves evidence. The limitation is ethical constraints on further invasive testing. Scholarly debate now centers on ritual meaning rather than cause of death. This reframes inquiry. The limitation is abstract interpretation. The screaming mummy's fame has overshadowed more typical cases. This skews focus. The limitation is disproportionate attention. The combination of impure wrapping and unusual embalming suggests symbolic messaging. This implies social statement. The limitation is decoding symbolism without text. Despite modern techniques, definitive conclusions remain out of reach. This sustains uncertainty. The limitation is evidentiary silence. At this investigative stage, the screaming mummy is better understood physically than culturally. The implication is partial clarity, while the limitation remains unchanged. Intent cannot be confirmed. The screaming mummy's unresolved status highlights how visual anomalies can dominate interpretation in the absence of context. Appearance becomes evidence by default. The limitation is that visual cues are among the least reliable indicators of historical cause or intent. In ancient Egyptian practice, deviation from funerary norms carried meaning, but meanings varied by period and circumstance. This implies flexibility rather than uniform rules. The limitation is assuming consistent symbolism across centuries. The mummy's treatment may reflect a specific legal or ritual category now undocumented. This implies institutional practices beyond surviving texts. The limitation is that undocumented categories cannot be reconstructed with certainty. The contrast between careful preservation and symbolic degradation complicates binary interpretations. This implies mixed intent. The limitation is interpreting contradiction without explanatory records. Museum handling and early unwrapping altered the mummy's condition. This affects interpretation. The limitation is irreversible disturbance of original evidence. The case illustrates how later handling can amplify mystery rather than resolve it. This influences modern narratives. The limitation is separation of ancient actions from modern intervention. Scientific caution has reduced sensational claims, but has not produced closure. This implies methodological maturity. The limitation is acceptance of uncertainty. The Screaming Mummy demonstrates how punishment, ritual, and preservation can intersect. This suggests complex social signaling. The limitation is decoding signals without textual support. Some scholars argue the anomaly reflects political messaging intended for contemporaries, not future observers. This reframes purpose. The limitation is inability to test audience reception. The mummy's placement among royal remains may indicate protection of lineage despite punishment. This implies nuanced political compromise. The limitation is speculative reconstruction. Comparative cases of denied afterlife rights are rare and poorly documented. This limits contextualization. The limitation is insufficient comparative data. The absence of definitive trauma shifts focus from death to burial. This narrows inquiry. The limitation is incomplete understanding of mortuary variation. Advances in biomolecular analysis may yet refine identity. This suggests future insight. The limitation is degradation of ancient DNA. Ethical constraints limit destructive testing on rare mummies. This preserves heritage. The limitation is restricted evidence access. Public fascination persists because the image contradicts expectations of Egyptian mummification. This sustains interest. The limitation is expectation bias. The case reveals how exceptions illuminate norms. Deviation draws attention to standard practice. The limitation is overemphasis on outliers. The Screaming Mummy resists definitive categorization as victim, criminal, or ritual subject. This ambiguity defines the mystery. The limitation is categorical overlap. Scholarly consensus favors restrained interpretation grounded in material evidence. This reflects discipline standards. The limitation is unresolved central questions. The mummy's condition underscores how meaning can be lost even when bodies survive. This highlights historical fragility. The limitation is irreversible context loss. The narrative has shifted from sensational death to complex ritual analysis. This improves accuracy. The limitation is reduced narrative clarity. The case continues to inform debates about justice and ritual in ancient Egypt. This broadens significance. The limitation is extrapolation from a single example. Absence of inscriptions remains the primary barrier to identification. This constrains conclusions. The limitation is evidentiary silence. The Screaming Mummy exemplifies how archaeology confronts uncertainty without resolution. This shapes methodology. The limitation is acceptance of ambiguity. Continued study refines what the mummy is not, rather than what it is. This narrows possibilities. The limitation is negative definition. The balance between preservation and interpretation remains delicate. This affects future research. The limitation is methodological constraint. The mummy's fame ensures ongoing attention, but attention does not equal answers. This sustains inquiry. The limitation is persistent uncertainty. Without new textual or material discoveries, interpretations will remain provisional. This constrains progress. The limitation is dependence on chance. The Screaming Mummy stands as a case where evidence survives, but explanation does not. This defines its mystery. The limitation is separation of fact from meaning. The unresolved nature of the case reflects the broader limits of reconstructing intent for material remains alone. This informs historical humility. The limitation is epistemological. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you. Crystal skulls are carved objects made primarily of quartz crystal, shaped to resemble human skulls. Several examples surfaced in museums and private collections during the 19th century. The implication is ancient origin claims, while the limitation is that early documentation of their discovery is incomplete. The most famous crystal skulls were attributed to Mesoamerican civilizations, particularly the Maya and Aztec cultures. This attribution implies pre-Columbian craftsmanship. The limitation is that no authenticated archaeological excavation has ever recovered a crystal skull in situ. quartz crystal is extremely hard, ranking 7 on the Mohs scale. This implies advanced carving techniques would be required. The limitation is uncertainty about whether such techniques were available to ancient Mesoamerican societies. Many crystal skulls entered collections through antiquities markets rather than controlled excavations. This implies broken provenance. The limitation is inability to establish reliable historical context. 19th century Europe saw increased fascination with exotic artifacts from the Americas. This cultural environment implies strong demand. The limitation is that market demand incentivized fabrication and misattribution. Museums initially accepted several crystal skulls as authentic ancient objects. This implies institutional endorsement. The limitation is that early authentication standards were limited. The British Museum and the Musée du Quai Branly each hold crystal skulls with disputed origins. This implies international distribution. The limitation is absence of excavation records linking them to ancient sites. Early accounts claimed the skulls were discovered in Central American ruins. This suggests archaeological context. The limitation is that these claims often trace back to dealers rather than archaeologists. Carving crystal requires prolonged abrasion with harder materials. This implies extensive labor. The limitation is determining whether hand tools could achieve the observed precision. Some skulls display highly symmetrical features and polished surfaces. This implies controlled mechanical processes. The limitation is that symmetry alone does not prove modern manufacture. Scientific analysis of tool marks has been central to evaluating authenticity. This implies material-based investigation. The limitation is that surface polishing can obscure tool traces. In the 20th century, advances in microscopy allowed closer examination of crystal skulls. This improved analytical capability. The limitation is that not all skulls were examined under identical conditions. Studies revealed circular tool marks consistent with rotary grinding wheels on several skulls. This implies modern techniques. The limitation is that not every skull shows identical markings. Quartz from different geological sources has distinct inclusions. This allows provenance testing. The limitation is incomplete reference databases for ancient trade routes. Chemical and structural analysis suggests some skulls were carved from Brazilian quartz. This implies post-Columbian material sourcing. The limitation is that trade routes expanded rapidly after European contact. No known pre-Columbian artwork depicts crystal skulls. This absence challenges cultural attribution. The limitation is that absence of depiction does not definitively prove non-existence. Mesoamerican skull imagery typically appears in stone reliefs and ceramics. This suggests stylistic conventions. The limitation is that crystal is a rare medium in surviving artifacts. The lack of wear consistent with ritual handling raises questions about usage. This implies limited ancient use. The limitation is that objects may have been preserved deliberately. Several crystal skulls are anatomically inaccurate in ways inconsistent with Mesoamerican artistic styles. This implies external influence. The limitation is subjectivity in stylistic comparison. Some skulls gained notoriety through association with collectors known for acquiring forged artifacts. This implies credibility concerns. The limitation is that association alone does not prove forgery. Scientific testing by the Smithsonian Institution and other bodies has concluded that several skulls are modern. This implies institutional reassessment. The limitation is that conclusions vary between specimens. Despite evidence of modern manufacture, public belief in ancient origins persists. This implies cultural attachment. The limitation is that belief does not equal evidence. Media portrayals often amplified mystical narratives around crystal skulls. This shaped perception. The limitation is distortion of scholarly findings. The persistence of disputed examples keeps the debate active. This implies unresolved cases. The limitation is uneven quality of available data. No crystal skull has been conclusively dated to a pre-Columbian context. This is a central fact. The limitation is that dating quartz directly is difficult. Authentication relies on indirect indicators such as tool marks and provenance. This implies inferential methodology. The limitation is probabilistic conclusions. Some researchers argue that a small number of skulls remain insufficiently tested. This suggests open questions. The limitation is access restrictions. The crystal skull phenomenon highlights the intersection of archaeology and the antiquities market. This implies economic influence. The limitation is disentangling commerce from culture. Scholarly consensus increasingly views most crystal skulls as 19th century creations. This reflects accumulated evidence. The limitation is that consensus allows for rare exceptions. At this contextual stage, crystal skulls are defined by disputed origins, scientific scrutiny, and missing archaeological context. The implication is unresolved authenticity, while the limitation remains clear. Without excavation evidence, certainty is constrained. Modern scientific investigations into crystal skulls focus on manufacturing techniques rather than symbolic meaning. This implies a shift from cultural interpretation to material analysis. The limitation is that technical findings cannot reconstruct the intentions behind their creation. Scanning electron microscopy has been used to examine surface striations on several skulls. This reveals tool marks consistent with rotary grinding. The limitation is that extensive polishing can obscure earlier hand tool traces. Rotary grinding wheels became common only after the Industrial Revolution. This implies modern manufacture for many skulls. The limitation is that presence of such marks does not establish an exact date. Some skulls show traces of silicon carbide abrasives. This material was not available before the late 19th century. The implication is post-Columbian production. The limitation is that contamination during later handling cannot be entirely ruled out. Researchers have compared skull anatomy to real human skulls. Several examples display inaccuracies in dental structure and cranial sutures. This implies limited anatomical knowledge. The limitation is variation exists in artistic representations. Mesoamerican artistic traditions followed symbolic conventions rather than anatomical realism. This complicates comparison. The limitation is distinguishing symbolic deviation from technical error. Tool mark orientation suggests the use of mechanized equipment capable of consistent rotation. This implies workshop conditions. The limitation is that not all skulls show identical machining patterns. Provenance research reveals many skulls pass through a small number of European dealers. This implies centralized distribution. The limitation is incomplete documentation of private sales. The antiquities market of the 19th century often lacked rigorous authentication. This allowed misattributed objects to circulate. The limitation is retrospective reconstruction of transactions. Some collectors promoted mystical narratives to increase value. This implies intentional myth-making. The limitation is separating marketing claims from original intent. Museum reevaluations in the late 20th century led to reclassification of several skulls as modern. This reflects improved standards. The limitation is uneven application across institutions. A few skulls remain inaccessible to independent testing. This limits verification. The implication is incomplete dataset. Public exhibitions often emphasize mystery over scientific findings. This shapes perception. The limitation is misalignment between scholarship and presentation. The durability of quartz means skulls can survive handling without wear. This complicates age assessment. The limitation is lack of direct dating methods. Researchers have attempted to replicate skull carving using pre-Columbian tools. This demonstrates feasibility with extreme labor investment. The limitation is that replication does not prove historical occurrence. Replication experiments require hundreds of hours of abrasion. This implies significant resource allocation. The limitation is lack of evidence for such effort in ancient contexts. No workshop sites associated with crystal skull production have been identified in Mesoamerica. This absence challenges ancient origin claims. The limitation is incomplete archaeological coverage. Chemical analysis of inclusions suggests some quartz sources were unavailable to pre-Columbian cultures. This implies later sourcing. The limitation is uncertainty about ancient trade networks. Some defenders of authenticity argue that scientific methods are biased toward modern explanations. This implies methodological debate. The limitation is that criticism does not refute empirical findings. The distinction between individual skulls is often blurred in public discourse. This leads to generalized conclusions. The limitation is that each object requires separate analysis. Academic consensus differentiates between myth and material evidence. This narrows interpretation. The limitation is allowance for rare exceptions. The crystal skull phenomenon illustrates how artifacts can acquire meanings unrelated to origin. This implies cultural layering. The limitation is disentangling layers. Claims of ancient ceremonial use lack supporting iconography. This absence weakens ritual theories. The limitation is incomplete survival of symbolic art. Museums now contextualize skulls within the history of collecting and forgery. This reframes significance. The limitation is diminished focus on original cultural narratives. Scientific testing continues to refine conclusions. This suggests progress. The limitation is diminishing likelihood of reversal. The persistence of belief in ancient origins reflects psychological appeal. This sustains public interest. The limitation is belief independent of evidence. Crystal skulls are now studied as examples of historical misattribution. This implies educational value. The limitation is disappointment for those seeking ancient mystery. The debate highlights the importance of provenance in archaeology. Without it, interpretation weakens. The limitation is irreversible loss of context. Despite extensive testing, absolute certainty remains difficult. This reflects methodological limits. The limitation is probabilistic assessment. At this investigative stage, crystal skulls are largely understood as modern creations shaped by market forces and belief, while a small margin of uncertainty persists due to incomplete access and data. The enduring fascination with crystal skulls demonstrates how objects can retain mystery even after scientific explanation. This suggests that cultural narratives often outlast empirical findings. The limitation is that fascination does not indicate unresolved authenticity. The skull's association with ancient civilizations has influenced popular media for decades. This implies narrative reinforcement. The limitation is that repetition of claims can obscure corrective evidence. Archaeology increasingly treats crystal skulls as case studies in the history of collecting. This reframes their importance. The limitation is that this perspective shifts focus away from original cultural contexts. The persistence of disputed examples highlights uneven access to scientific testing. This implies incomplete verification. The limitation is that restricted access prevents uniform conclusions. Some proponents argue that scientific tools cannot detect ancient techniques unknown to modern researchers. This implies epistemic limits. The limitation is lack of supporting evidence for such techniques. The debate illustrates how absence of context complicates authentication more than material composition. This emphasizes provenance. The limitation is that lost context cannot be reconstructed. Crystal skulls challenge assumptions about what constitutes ancient artistry. This broadens inquiry. The limitation is conflating artistic skill with chronological origin. Museums now emphasize transparency in labeling disputed artifacts. This reflects ethical responsibility. The limitation is that earlier mislabeling influenced long-term perception. The skull's role in exhibitions often balances skepticism with audience interest. This implies institutional compromise. The limitation is potential dilution of scientific clarity. Scholarly consensus does not equate to unanimity. This leaves room for debate. The limitation is that debate persists despite strong evidence. The case demonstrates how scientific reassessment can overturn long-held beliefs. This underscores methodological strength. The limitation is resistance to change in public belief. Crystal skulls remain relevant as symbols of how myths can be manufactured. This implies cautionary value. The limitation is focusing on process rather than object. The intersection of commerce and archaeology in this case reveals vulnerabilities in heritage protection. This has broader implications. The limitation is historical specificity. Modern audiences often seek mystery, even when explanations exist. This shapes reception. The limitation is preference for uncertainty. The skull's survival owes more to durability than significance. This affects interpretation. The limitation is survival bias. Continued research refines understanding, but rarely reverses conclusions. This implies stability of findings. The limitation is residual uncertainty. The case illustrates how scientific evidence can be gradual and cumulative. This shapes methodology. The limitation is lack of dramatic resolution. Crystal skulls highlight the need for critical evaluation of extraordinary claims. This informs practice. The limitation is applying skepticism consistently. The unresolved margin of uncertainty sustains discussion. This keeps the topic active. The limitation is that uncertainty is narrow. Archaeological inquiry accepts probabilistic conclusions rather than absolute proof. This defines discipline limits. The limitation is acceptance of ambiguity. The skull's history reflects shifting standards in museum practice. This informs institutional learning. The limitation is historical hindsight. The debate underscores the role of technology in correcting earlier assumptions. This suggests progress. The limitation is dependence on future tools. Crystal skulls function as artifacts of modern belief as much as material objects. This reframes meaning. The limitation is disentangling belief from evidence. The persistence of controversy reveals how knowledge is negotiated socially. This broadens analysis. The limitation is sociological inference. The case continues to be cited in discussions of forgery and authentication. This maintains relevance. The limitation is topic saturation. The inability to conclusively test every specimen leaves a residual question. This defines remaining mystery. The limitation is access constraint. Scholars agree that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This principle guides assessment. The limitation is meeting that standard. Crystal skulls remain instructive precisely because they were once believed to be ancient. This informs caution. The limitation is retrospective clarity. The phenomenon persists not because of what is known, but because of how belief endures. This explains longevity. The limitation is conflation of belief and fact. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you. The Copper Scroll is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1952 in Cave 3 near Qumran. Unlike the others, it was engraved on copper rather than written on parchment. This implies a different purpose, while the limitation is uncertainty about why this material was chosen. The scroll lists locations of buried gold and silver, described in precise quantities. This implies an inventory rather than a religious text. The limitation is that the listed measurements and locations are difficult to interpret. Copper was an unusual medium for writing in antiquity. This implies an intent for durability. The limitation is that engraving makes corrections impossible, suggesting high confidence or finality. The text was too brittle to unroll and had to be cut into sections. This implies preservation challenges. The limitation is that cutting risked loss of information. Unlike other Dead Sea Scrolls, the Copper Scroll is written in a form of Hebrew closer to spoken language. This implies practical use. The limitation is ambiguity about authorship. The scroll references dozens of hidden caches containing precious metals. This implies real assets. The limitation is that none have been conclusively recovered. Quantities listed are extremely large, totaling tons of metal. This implies substantial wealth. The limitation is skepticism about whether such amounts could realistically exist. The locations are described using landmarks that no longer exist. This implies historical change. The limitation is inability to map descriptions accurately. Scholars debate whether the scroll refers to actual treasure or symbolic deposits. This implies interpretive divergence. The limitation is lack of corroborating texts. The scroll does not explain who hid the treasure or why. This implies secrecy. The limitation is absence of contextual narrative. Some researchers link the scroll to the Second Temple period. This implies a connection to Jerusalem's temple wealth. The limitation is that the scroll was not found in Jerusalem. The Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE provides historical context for hiding valuables. This implies motive. The limitation is temporal uncertainty of the scroll's creation. Linguistic analysis suggests multiple scribes or stages of composition. This implies collaborative effort. The limitation is that engraving style limits certainty. The scroll lists specific measurements using ancient units. This implies technical precision. The limitation is uncertainty in converting those units to modern values. The copper scroll differs in tone from sectarian Qumran texts. This implies it may not belong to the same community. The limitation is proximity of discovery influencing assumptions. Some locations appear to reference water sources or tunnels. This implies concealment strategies. The limitation is altered landscapes. Archaeological searches based on the scroll have been conducted. This implies testability. The limitation is that none have produced definitive results. The scroll contains no religious doctrine or moral instruction. This implies functional intent. The limitation is rarity of such documents. The use of copper suggests expectation of long-term concealment. This implies planning for future recovery. The limitation is that no recovery occurred. Scholars question whether the scroll was a copy of an earlier document. This implies transmission. The limitation is absence of originals. The scroll's discovery among religious texts complicates classification. This implies mixed context. The limitation is association by location alone. Some argue the scroll was intended for insiders familiar with the landscape. This implies restricted knowledge. The limitation is loss of that knowledge. The precision of directions contrasts with the inability to locate sites today. This implies contextual dependency. The limitation is temporal displacement. Metallurgical analysis confirms the copper alloy dates to antiquity. This supports authenticity. The limitation is that authenticity does not confirm accuracy. The scroll has been translated multiple times with varying interpretations. This implies linguistic ambiguity. The limitation is translation uncertainty. The absence of accompanying maps complicates use. This implies reliance on memory. The limitation is isolation of the text. Some scholars suggest the scroll lists temple treasures hidden before Roman conquest. This implies historical urgency. The limitation is lack of independent confirmation. Others propose it describes a symbolic inventory rather than physical caches. This implies metaphor. The limitation is speculative interpretation. No mention of recovery instructions appears in the text. This implies incomplete documentation. The limitation is missing procedural context. At this contextual stage, the copper scroll stands as a unique ancient document describing hidden wealth without verifiable recovery. The implication is unresolved intent, while the limitation remains clear. The text cannot be tested conclusively. Continued study of the copper scroll has focused on whether its contents describe a real, centralized treasury or multiple dispersed deposits. This implies organized concealment. The limitation is that the text provides no overarching explanation, linking the listed caches into a single system. Some scholars argue the quantities listed exceed what is known of local economic capacity. This implies exaggeration or symbolic accounting. The limitation is uncertainty, about ancient wealth accumulation and reporting practices. The scroll's references to gold and silver use technical terminology rather than religious language. This suggests administrative intent. The limitation is that technical language alone does not confirm practical usability. Comparisons with other Second Temple period texts show no parallel documents listing hidden treasure. This implies uniqueness. The limitation is that unique documents are difficult to contextualize. The Copper Scroll's directions often rely on relative distances rather than fixed coordinates. This implies local knowledge. The limitation is that such knowledge was not preserved. Archaeological teams have attempted to match descriptions with known sites around Jerusalem and the Judean desert. This implies investigative testing. The limitation is that landscape modification over 2 millennia obscures correlations. Some locations described appear to reference subterranean spaces. This implies use of tunnels or chambers. The limitation is that many ancient tunnels remain inaccessible or undiscovered. The scroll does not mention defensive measures or traps. This implies reliance on secrecy rather than protection. The limitation is that absence of mention does not confirm absence of measures. Linguistic analysis indicates the Hebrew used is non-literary and utilitarian. This supports functional interpretation. The limitation is that functional style does not guarantee factual accuracy. Debate continues over whether the scroll was intended as a working document or a ceremonial record. This implies dual possibilities. The limitation is lack of contextual clues. The scroll's discovery location raises questions about why a treasure list would be stored with religious manuscripts. This implies convergence of communities. The limitation is assuming shared authorship. Some researchers propose the scroll was brought to Qumran for safekeeping during crisis. This implies urgency. The limitation is absence of supporting documentation. The Roman campaign in Judea involved systematic confiscation of wealth. This supports a motive for concealment. The limitation is linking specific events to the scroll. No Roman records mention the recovery of such large hidden treasuries. This absence implies concealment success or non-existence. The limitation is incomplete Roman documentation. The scroll's lack of narrative context forces interpretation to rely on external history. This implies reconstruction. The limitation is inferential dependency. Scholars disagree on whether the treasure described could still exist. This implies ongoing relevance. The limitation is lack of recoveries after extensive searching. Some argue the scroll is a theoretical inventory compiled before concealment. This implies planning rather than execution. The limitation is no indication of subsequent action. The precise listing of weights suggests accountability. This implies record keeping. The limitation is absence of confirmation that deposits matched records. The Copper Scroll's survival contrasts with the loss of any associated explanatory texts. This implies selective preservation. The limitation is fragmented evidence. Modern translations vary in interpreting key terms related to location and containers. This implies semantic ambiguity. The limitation is linguistic uncertainty. The scroll's material durability ensured survival, but its content remained opaque. This highlights a paradox. The limitation is durable medium without durable meaning. Some scholars interpret the scroll as a symbolic assertion of hidden sacred wealth. This implies ideological purpose. The limitation is speculative reading. Archaeological methodology favors corroboration through material finds. The Copper Scroll resists this approach. The limitation is methodological mismatch. The scroll's existence challenges assumptions about the Dead Sea Scrolls as purely religious. This broadens understanding. The limitation is categorization difficulty. No consensus exists on the scroll's authoring group. This complicates attribution. The limitation is absence of identifiers. The Copper Scroll remains the only known ancient text engraved to preserve a treasure list. This uniqueness sustains debate. The limitation is lack of comparative cases. Modern technology has improved imaging of inscriptions, but not interpretation. This highlights limits of tools. The limitation is contextual loss. Some researchers suggest the treasure was recovered in antiquity, rendering the list obsolete. This implies historical closure. The limitation is no record of recovery. Others argue the scroll represents wealth never retrieved. This implies enduring mystery. The limitation is absence of proof. At this investigative stage, the copper scroll continues to resist classification as factual inventory or symbolic record. The implication is unresolved purpose, while the limitation remains. Without discovery of any cache, conclusions remain provisional. The copper scroll's unresolved status has led scholars to reconsider assumptions about ancient documentation practices. This implies flexibility in record keeping. The limitation is that modern expectations of clarity may not apply to ancient crisis contexts. Comparisons with later medieval treasure lists show similar reliance on local landmarks. This suggests a practical tradition. The limitation is that medieval parallels do not confirm ancient intent. The scroll's silence on ownership raises questions about who controlled the listed wealth. This implies collective or institutional possession. The limitation is lack of identifying markers. Some interpretations suggest the list was meant for a future generation. This implies delayed recovery. The limitation is absence of timed indicators. The scale of the treasure has fueled skepticism about literal interpretation. This implies exaggeration. The limitation is incomplete knowledge of Second Temple resources. Archaeological failures to locate any cache have shaped modern skepticism. This implies negative evidence. The limitation is that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The scroll's detailed directions contrast with their modern uselessness. This implies dependence on a vanished landscape. The limitation is irreversible environmental change. Some scholars argue the text reflects administrative fragmentation during crisis. This implies hurried compilation. The limitation is interpretive speculation. The copper scroll challenges the boundary between archive and instruction manual. This blurs genre classification. The limitation is categorical ambiguity. Advances in geospatial modeling have been applied to the scroll's locations. This suggests methodological innovation. The limitation is speculative correlation. The document's durability contrasts with the fragility of its meaning. This highlights historical irony. The limitation is philosophical framing. Debate continues over whether the scroll was ever meant to be acted upon. This implies symbolic intent. The limitation is lack of corroboration. The scroll's presence among religious manuscripts complicates interpretation. This suggests coexistence of sacred and practical texts. The limitation is contextual assumption. Scholars emphasize caution against literal treasure-hunting interpretations. This reflects academic restraint. The limitation is public expectation. The copper scroll remains central to discussions about hidden wealth in antiquity. This sustains interest. The limitation is repetitive inquiry. The lack of accompanying maps or diagrams remains a critical obstacle. This limits application. The limitation is missing supporting materials. Interpretations increasingly focus on what the scroll reveals about fear and loss during crisis. This reframes significance. The limitation is psychological inference. The document illustrates how information can survive while meaning disappears. This defines its mystery. The limitation is irreversible loss. Without discovery of any cache, evaluation remains theoretical. This constrains conclusions. The limitation is empirical failure. The copper scroll has influenced modern imagination more than archaeological practice. This shapes perception. The limitation is cultural bias. The text continues to be studied for linguistic and historical insight rather than treasure. This shifts purpose. The limitation is unmet original function. The scroll's uniqueness ensures ongoing debate despite limited progress. This sustains relevance. The limitation is diminishing returns. Scholars accept that the scroll may never be fully understood. This reflects methodological humility. The limitation is acceptance of uncertainty. The Copper Scroll demonstrates the limits of textual evidence without material confirmation. This informs archaeology broadly. The limitation is evidentiary imbalance. The mystery persists not because of hidden clues, but because context is lost. This defines the case. The limitation is finality. The scroll stands as a reminder that documentation does not guarantee recovery. This has broader implications. The limitation is generalization. Each proposed explanation resolves some questions while raising others. This sustains debate. The limitation is partial explanation. The Copper Scroll remains unresolved despite decades of study. This underscores its status. The limitation is absence of closure. The document's significance lies in what it promises, but does not deliver. This frames interpretation. The limitation is interpretive tension. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you. The Yonaguni Monument is a submerged rock formation located off the coast of Yonaguni Island, Japan, discovered by a diver in 1986. Its sharp edges and step shapes prompted immediate debate. The implication is possible human modification, while the limitation is that discovery occurred outside an archaeological context. The structure lies approximately 25 meters below sea level in the East China Sea. This depth implies submersion after formation. The limitation is determining whether submersion occurred before or after any potential human activity. The monument consists of large flat surfaces, right angles, and terrace-like formations. These features imply intentional design. The limitation is that similar geometries can occur naturally in fractured sandstone. Marine geologist Masahaki Kimura has argued that the structure shows evidence of carving and human alteration. This implies prehistoric construction. The limitation is that Kimura's interpretation is disputed among geologists. Other scientists classify Yonaguni as a natural formation shaped by tectonic activity and erosion. This implies geological origin. The limitation is explaining the regularity and scale of some features. Yonaguni Island lies in a seismically active region. This context implies frequent fracturing along natural plains. The limitation is that tectonic fractures alone may not account for all observed patterns. The rock is composed primarily of sandstone and mudstone, which fracture predictably. This supports natural explanations. The limitation is that predictability does not rule out modification. Some surfaces appear unusually smooth and planar. This implies potential shaping. The limitation is that underwater erosion can also produce smooth plains. The monument includes what appear to be stair-like steps. This suggests architectural intent. The limitation is that step-like erosion occurs in layered rock formations. No artifacts such as tools, pottery, or human remains have been found at the site. This absence challenges human construction theories. The limitation is that underwater contexts reduce artifact survival. Estimates suggest the structure would have been above sea level over 10,000 years ago. This implies extreme antiquity if man-made. The limitation is uncertainty in sea-level reconstruction. If constructed by humans, the monument would predate known Japanese civilizations. This implication challenges archaeological timelines. The limitation is lack of corroborating evidence elsewhere. The surrounding seabed contains scattered rocks with similar features. This suggests broader geological processes. The limitation is distinguishing central structure from surroundings. Divers report straight edges extending for dozens of meters. This scale implies planning. The limitation is human perception can overinterpret geometric forms. Photographic and video documentation varies in quality. This affects analysis. The limitation is that distortion underwater can misrepresent shapes. No inscriptions or carvings clearly identifiable as symbolic have been documented. This absence limits cultural attribution. The limitation is that erosion may have removed markings. The monument's discovery sparked comparisons to other submerged sites worldwide. This implies global patterns. The limitation is that comparisons do not establish connection. Some proponents suggest Yonaguni represents a sunken city or ceremonial center. This implies complex society. The limitation is absence of settlement evidence. Critics argue that labeling natural formations as artificial reflects pattern recognition bias. This implies cognitive influence. The limitation is separating bias from observation. Japanese authorities have not classified Yonaguni as a confirmed archaeological site. This reflects institutional caution. The limitation is that classification depends on evidence thresholds. Underwater surveys have mapped the structure in detail. This provides data. The limitation is that mapping alone cannot determine origin. The monument's sharp edges contrast with rounded features nearby. This implies selective processes. The limitation is geological heterogeneity. Sediment buildup on some surfaces suggests long-term submersion. This implies age. The limitation is dating sediment accurately. No definitive tool marks have been identified. This challenges carving theories. The limitation is that tool marks erode over millennia. The site remains accessible only to experienced divers. This limits study. The limitation is restricted observation time. Media portrayals often exaggerate artificiality. This shapes public belief. The limitation is distortion of scientific debate. Scholarly articles remain divided on interpretation. This implies unresolved status. The limitation is lack of decisive evidence. Yonaguni exists at the intersection of geology and archaeology. This complicates analysis. The limitation is disciplinary boundary. The monument's regular forms continue to challenge simple explanations. This sustains inquiry. The limitation is interpretive ambiguity. At this contextual stage, the Yonaguni monument is defined by striking geometry, competing interpretations, and absence of definitive proof. The implication is unresolved origin, while the limitation remains clear. Evidence supports multiple explanations. Subsequent investigations have attempted to isolate features that could only result from human activity. This implies a methodological approach. The limitation is that criteria for distinguishing artificial from natural underwater formations remain debated. Detailed surveys show that many edges align with natural bedding planes in the rock. This supports geological explanations. The limitation is that alignment does not exclude later modification. Some flat surfaces appear unusually extensive compared to surrounding formations. This implies selective shaping. The limitation is that erosion can preferentially remove softer material. Kimura and colleagues identified what they interpret as carved channels and depressions. This implies functional design. The limitation is that similar features can arise from water flow and abrasion. Other geologists argue that fractures follow predictable right angles in sandstone under tectonic stress. This explains geometric forms. The limitation is explaining the apparent repetition of such features. Comparative studies with known underwater ruins emphasize the absence of associated debris at Yonaguni. This challenges artificial origin claims. The limitation is that debris disperses easily underwater. No evidence of habitation, such as anchors or domestic artifacts, has been recovered. This implies non-residential context. The limitation is that absence of evidence is not conclusive. Sea level rise after the last glacial maximum submerged many coastal features. This implies Yonaguni could predate flooding. The limitation is that dating submersion does not date construction. Radiometric dating of the rock itself reflects geological age, not shaping. This limits chronological analysis. The implication is methodological constraint. Some researchers propose that Yonaguni represents a naturally formed structure later used by humans. This implies hybrid use. The limitation is lack of material traces, confirming human interaction. Diver reports describe staircases leading to flat platforms. This implies navigability. The limitation is that human interpretation influences perception. The monument's scale suggests any construction would require significant labor. This implies organized society. The limitation is absence of corroborating archaeological evidence on land. Japanese prehistoric sites on nearby islands show no matching architectural tradition. This weakens construction theories. The limitation is incomplete archaeological coverage. Ocean currents around Yonaguni are strong, accelerating erosion. This supports natural shaping. The limitation is assessing erosion rates over millennia. Some scholars emphasize caution in labeling features as stairs or walls. This implies semantic bias. The limitation is that descriptive language shapes interpretation. Photogrammetry has improved three-dimensional modeling of the site. This aids analysis. The limitation is that models still require interpretation. The monument's isolation complicates comparative study. This limits contextualization. The limitation is singularity. Public fascination often frames Yonaguni as evidence of lost civilizations. This influences discourse. The limitation is separation of popular narrative from evidence. Academic consensus currently favors a natural origin with unusual geometry. This reflects majority interpretation. The limitation is acknowledgement of unresolved anomalies. Some features remain difficult to explain purely through erosion. This sustains debate. The limitation is that difficulty does not equal artificiality. The lack of consensus highlights disciplinary differences between geology and archaeology. This affects conclusions. The limitation is methodological divergence. Funding and access limitations restrict long-term study. This slows progress. The limitation is resource constraint. Yonaguni challenges assumptions about pattern recognition in archaeology. This has broader implications. The limitation is subjective interpretation. Experimental geology attempts to replicate similar forms through natural processes. This suggests plausibility. The limitation is replicating exact conditions. The monument's continued exposure to erosion alters its features. This complicates longitudinal study. The limitation is ongoing change. Some researchers call for reframing the debate away from binary classification. This implies nuanced understanding. The limitation is reduced clarity. Yonaguni remains an instructive case in interdisciplinary investigation. This broadens significance. The limitation is unresolved origin. Each new survey refines measurements, but not conclusions. This underscores limits of data. The limitation is interpretive ceiling. The monument's ambiguity sustains scientific interest. This keeps inquiry active. The limitation is absence of decisive evidence. At this investigative stage, Yonaguni continues to be interpreted through competing geological and archaeological frameworks. The implication is persistent uncertainty, while the limitation remains unchanged. Material evidence does not confirm human construction. The ongoing debate over Yonaguni reflects how extraordinary formations test disciplinary boundaries. Geologists and archaeologists apply different standards of evidence. The limitation is that no shared framework exists to definitively resolve cases that sit between natural formation and potential modification. Comparisons with other submerged sites often emphasize context rather than form. This implies that associated artifacts are crucial. The limitation is that Yonaguni lacks such contextual materials. The monument's sharp angles continue to attract attention because they contrast with expectations of underwater erosion. This implies anomaly. The limitation is that expectations are based on general patterns, not absolute rules. Human perception tends to identify familiar shapes in complex environments. This cognitive tendency implies risk of misinterpretation. The limitation is separating perception from physical process. Some researchers argue that if Yonaguni were artificial, evidence should exist on nearby land. This implies integrated settlement. The limitation is that coastal sites are especially vulnerable to erosion and loss. The structure's isolation offshore complicates logistical explanations for construction. This implies improbability. The limitation is that improbability alone does not disprove occurrence. Underwater archaeology faces inherent constraints, including limited visibility and time. This affects data quality. The limitation is incomplete observation. Yanaguni's case highlights how absence of artifacts weighs heavily against human construction theories. This reflects archaeological standards. The limitation is that standards are based on terrestrial sites. Geological processes can create forms that mimic human architecture. This complicates interpretation. The limitation is distinguishing mimicry from intention. Some proponents suggest that future discoveries elsewhere may contextualize Yanaguni retroactively. This implies deferred understanding. The limitation is reliance on hypothetical findings. Scientific caution prioritizes conservative explanations when evidence is ambiguous. This favors natural origin. The limitation is potential underestimation of rare human activity. Yanaguni continues to be cited in discussions about submerged landscapes after the last ice age. This broadens relevance. The limitation is speculative linkage. The monument's endurance under erosion suggests structural robustness. This implies material strength. The limitation is that robustness applies to both natural and artificial structures. Debate persists partly because the site cannot be excavated in the traditional sense. This limits intervention. The limitation is methodological constraint. The question of intent remains central. Natural processes have no intent. Human builders do. This distinction defines the debate. The limitation is that intent leaves indirect traces. Yanaguni demonstrates how geology can challenge archaeological intuition. This informs interdisciplinary humility. The limitation is unresolved classification. The site has influenced public imagination more than academic consensus. This affects discourse. The limitation is divergence between perception and evidence. Scholarly publications emphasize uncertainty rather than definitive claims. This reflects responsible practice. The limitation is lack of closure. The monument's ambiguity ensures continued research interest. This sustains study. The limitation is diminishing likelihood of resolution. Over time, erosion may further obscure defining features. This reduces future clarity. The limitation is irreversible change. Yanaguni's debate illustrates how scientific disagreement can persist without resolution. This informs understanding of inquiry. The limitation is acceptance of uncertainty. The absence of new decisive data reinforces conservative interpretations. This stabilizes consensus. The limitation is reliance on existing evidence. The monument challenges assumptions about what constitutes proof of human construction. This prompts reflection. The limitation is definitional ambiguity. Yanaguni remains a reference point in discussions of natural versus artificial structures. This sustains relevance. The limitation is unresolved origin. The case underscores the importance of context over form in archaeology. This shapes methodology. The limitation is that context may be permanently lost. Without associated cultural material, classification remains provisional. This constrains conclusions. The limitation is evidentiary silence. Yanaguni's features continue to resist definitive categorization. This defines its mystery. The limitation is interpretive balance. The monument's significance lies as much in the debate it generates as in the structure itself. This reframes importance. The limitation is meta-analysis. The lack of consensus reflects the limits of current methods. This informs future research priorities. The limitation is present capability. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you.